It is the 41st millennium. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. He is the master of mankind by the will of the gods, and master of 1,000,000 worlds by the might of his inexhaustible armies. He is a rotting carcass, writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. He is the carrion lord of the Imperium, for whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed every day, so that he may never truly die. Yet, even in his deathless state, the Emperor continues his eternal vigilance. Mighty battle fleets across the demon-infested miasma of the warp, the only route between distant stars, their way lit by the Astronomicon, the psychic manifestation of the Emperor's will. Vast armies give battle in his name on uncounted worlds. Greatest amongst his soldiers are the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, bioengineered super warriors. Their comrades in arms are Legion, the Imperial Guard, and countless planetary defense forces, the ever-vigilant Inquisition, and the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, to name only a few. But for all their multitudes, they are barely enough to hold off the ever-present threat from aliens, heretics, mutants, and worse. To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. These are the tales of those times. Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the Grimdark Future, there is only war. There is no peace amongst the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter, and the laughter of thirsting gods.
I am 42 standard years old, in my prime by Imperial standards, young by those of the Inquisition. All my life, I have had a reputation for being cold, unfeeling. Some have called me heartless, ruthless, even cruel. I am not. I am not beyond emotional response or compassion, but I possess, and my masters count this as perhaps my paramount virtue, a singular force of will. Throughout my career, it has served me well to draw on this facility and steel myself unflinching at all that this wretched galaxy can throw at me. To feel pain or fear or grief is to allow myself a luxury I cannot afford. As a devoted member of His High Majesty, the God Emperor's Inquisition, I find my philosophy bends towards that of the Amalathians. To the outside galaxy, members of our orders appear much alike. An Inquisitor is an Inquisitor, a being of fear and persecution. It surprises many that internally we are riven with clashing ideologies. To express it in simple terms, some Inquisitors are Puritans and some are Radicals. Puritans believe in and enforce the traditional station of the Inquisition, working to purge our galactic community of any criminal or malevolent element, the triumvirate of evil, alien, mutant, and demon. Anything that clashes with the pure rule of mankind, the preaches of the ministerium and the letter of imperial law, is subject to a Puritan Inquisitor's attention. Hardline, traditional, merciless, that is the Puritan way. Radicals believe that any methods are allowable if they accomplish the inquisitorial task. Some, as I understand it, actually embrace and use forbidden resources, such as the warp itself, as weapons against the enemies of mankind. I have heard the arguments often enough. They appall me. Radical belief is heretical. I am a Puritan by calling and an Amalathian by choice. The ferociously strict ways of the monodominant philosophy oftentimes entices me, but there is precious little subtlety in their ways, and thus it is not for me. Amalathians take our name from the conclave at Mount Amalath. Our endeavor is to maintain the status quo of the Imperium, and we work to identify and destroy any persons or agencies that might destabilize the power of the Imperium from within, from without, or within. We believe in strength through unity. Change is the greatest enemy. We believe the God Emperor has a divine plan, and we work to sustain the Imperium in stability until that plan is made known. We deplore factions and infighting. Indeed, it is sometimes a painful irony that our beliefs mark us as a faction within the political helix of the Inquisition. We are the steadfast spine of the Imperium, its antibodies fighting disease, insanity, injury, invasion. I can think of no better way to serve, no better way to be an Inquisitor. So you have me then, pictured. Gregor Eisenhorn, Inquisitor, Puritan, Amalathian, 42 years old standard, and Inquisitor for the past 18 years. I am tall and broad at the shoulders, strong, resolute. I have already told you of my force of will, and you will have noted my prowess with the blade. What else is there? Am I clean-shaven? Yes. My eyes are dark, my hair darker and thick. These things matter little. Come, and let me show you how I killed iClone.
Thorn wishes multifarious changelings. Pattern Thimble. Hubris 240M41. 11 months of Hubris's 29-month lunar year. The only signs of life were the custodians with their lighted poles and heat gowns, patrolling the precincts of the hibernation tombs. Within those sulking basalt and ceramite vaults, the nobility of Hubris slept, dreaming in crypts of aching ice, awaiting Thor, the middle season between dormant and vital. Even the air was frigid. Frost encrusted the tombs, and a thick cake of ice covered the featureless land. Above, star patterns twinkled in the curious, permanent night. One of them was Hubris's sun, so far away now. Come Thor, Hubris would spin into the warm embrace of its star again. Then it would become a blazing globe. Now it was just a fuzz of light. Vibben. I could hear her over the Vox links in our hoods. Eisenhorn. Eisenhorn. I ran. 5 years I had chased iClone, saboteur, anarchist and servant of chaos. I tracked him here to Hubris. He would not escape. Lores Vibben had served with me for 5.5 years. In that period she had saved my life twice. She saw herself as my aide and my bodyguard. Yet in truth she was more of a companion and fellow warrior. I stared down at her corpse, the blood around her already freezing. I kept staring down at her body. I believe I may have uttered her name. Thorn wishes Aegis, rapturous beast below. I voxed. Glossia. The basics of which I had designed 10 years before was reasonably complex and had evolved, organically with use. A lesson I had learned from my own mentor Inquisitor Habshant. Nearly 20 years since my elevation to the full rank of Inquisitor, fond memories swam in my mind, of the bond I shared with my fellow Titus Endor, an Inquisitor now in his own right. I thought of the dive bars we used to huddle in, amongst sketchy crowds, laughing and drinking off our complaints of Habshant. A servant of the Inquisition who makes chaos his tool against chaos is a greater enemy of mankind than chaos itself. Chaos knows the bounds of its own evil and accepts it. A servant of the Inquisition who uses chaos is fooling himself, denies the truth, and damns us all by his delusion. Words he had screamed to me and Endor within our first week. It was only when he had passed in our arms, due to a Xenos parasite, that I truly appreciated his strict discipline, psychic guidance, and puritanical beliefs. I have seen many people die, but still I stared at Vibin's body. I had almost been embarrassed when Vibin had given me a Scipio sidearm with customized grips. The gaudy and childish decorations now left an imprint in my palm as I squeezed it tight. 2 las shots flickered down at me as I ducked into cover, hiding through the maze of freezing vaults and pipes. I wondered why Iclone was here, why he was bringing the cryo-sleeping population out early, but sorted that thought to the back of my mind. I wanted blood. Eisenhorn. Gregor, is that you? Iclone. I knew his thin voice at once. I didn't answer. You're dead, you know, Gregor. Dead like they all are. Dead, dead, dead. Step out and make it quick. He was good. I'll give him that. My legs actually twitched, actually started to walk me clear of the cover into the open. Iclone was infamous across a dozen settled systems for his mind powers and mesmeric tone. How else had he managed to get these dark-eyed fools to do his bidding? But I have similar skills, and I have honed them well. I pitched my voice, balanced my mind, and yelled, "Show yourself first!" Iclone didn't succumb. I didn't expect him to. Like me, he had years of resilience training, but his 2 gunmen were easy meat. I put the rounds straight through their heads. I chased Iclone further into the galleries. We traded fire as the rounds bounced off the cryo tubes that held the sleeping nobility of hubris. Steam hissed, and cold air washed over me. A woman, slick with blood and cryo fluids, gripped my leg. I pushed her off. I should have killed her, put her out of her misery. I didn't. Do you think me weak? Flawed? Do you hate me for settling my inquisitorial role above the needs of one agonized being? If you do, I commend you. I still think of that woman. Still. And hate the fact I left her to die slowly. But if you hate me, I know this about you. You are no Inquisitor. You don't have the moral strength. I could have finished her, and my soul might have been relieved. But that would have been an end to my work. And I always think of the thousands, millions, perhaps, who would die worse deaths but for my actions. Is that arrogance? Perhaps. And perhaps arrogance is therefore a virtue of the Inquisition. I would gladly ignore 1 life in agony if I could save 100. 1,000. More. Mankind must suffer so that mankind can survive. It's that simple. Still, I dream of her, and her bloody anguish. Pity me for that at least. I pushed further into a vast chamber. The immense size told me that I was at the heart of the cryo chamber's control site. I clung to the shadows as I searched for Iclone and his men. Aegis, heaven's uplift, thrice 7-fold. A crown with stars. Infamous angel without title. To Thorn by 8. Pattern. I considered. I was in no mood to take any more chances. Thorn. Pattern Hawk. I responded. Pattern Hawk acknowledged. Midas said with relish. Midas Betancourt was a hot-blooded, impetuous man, which is partly why I liked him, and used him. Glavian circuitry was inlaid into his hands, making him a pilot of skill far beyond me. His skills in firearms was one of the best I'd ever seen. I knew he and Vibin had been something, and he was just as eager as me to see Iclone brought to justice. I put down more of Iclone's men, the latter ending in a scuffle that smashed aside my Scipio, and finding it in the hands of an enemy. Enough, I commanded, modulating my tone to emphasize my will, as I drove it into his mind. Drop it. He did, meekly, as if surprised. Psychotricks of will often baffle those who find themselves compelled by them. As he faltered, I threw a punch that connected well, and left him unconscious on the floor. As I bent to recover the Scipio, Betancourt voxed me again. Aegis, Pattern Hawk, infamous angel cast down, he said. Thorn acknowledged. Resume pattern crucible. I pushed on after my quarry. Finally, I saw him. Betancourt unleashed a beam of hot munitions as Iclone's men fired back in vain. Iclone, more intelligent than his men, had sprinted off to the platform to the hatch as the gun cutter rose into view, and that's where he ran into me. He opened his mouth in shock. I pushed the muzzle of Vibben's gun into it. I'm sure he wanted to say something important. I didn't care what it was. I painted his brain matter onto the cold steel of Hubris's cryo chamber. It was over, for now. Amos approached. We stood over the body. Uber Abos was my savant, and my longest-serving companion. He had come into my service in the first month of my career in the Inquisition, bequeathed to me by Inquisitor Habshant, who was by then dying of the cerebral worms. Amos was 278 standard years old, and had provided his service as a savant to 3 Inquisitors before me. He was alive only thanks to significant bionic augmentation to his digestive tract, liver, urinary system, hips and left leg. In Habshant's service, he had been injured by a stub round. Tending him, surgeons had found a chronically advanced and previously undiagnosed cancer rampant in his abdomen. Had he not been shot, he would have died within weeks. Thanks to the wound, the disease was found, exorcised, and his body repaired with plastic, ceramite and steel prosthetics. Amos referred to the whole ordeal as his lucky suffering. I still wore the twisted plug of the stub round that had almost taken and certainly saved his life on a chain around his stringy neck. I valued Amos, for very few possessed his eidetic memory, his talent at research, and his attention to detail. A shout came from behind, a martial tone calling for my name. The demanding voice rolled up from the chamber below us. I looked down. A man had entered the cryogenerated chamber, escorted by 4 custodians in heat gowns, carrying light poles aloft. He was tall, with pallid skin and greying hair. I didn't know who he was, but he looked like trouble to me. He began babbling, clearly looking for a target of his wrath. He tried to arrest me, Amos, and Betancourt. No, I said. I am an Inquisitor of the God Emperor of Mankind, Ordos Xenos. I will cooperate in any investigation you bring to bear here, fully and completely. But you will not and cannot detain me. Do you understand? An Inquisitor? The High Custodian stuttered. Do you understand? I repeated. I wasn't using my will at all. Not yet. I would if I had to. But I trusted that he would have the sense to listen to me first. He could make things awkward for me, but I could make things intolerable for him. I lamented the devastation to the nobility of hubris. Early and sudden exit from cryo-sleep for thousands almost meant certain death. But if I hadn't been here, more would have joined that fate. My retinue and I left the main hub of hubris. As its population slept, only a habitable region was lit, with the light and warmth of permanent habitation. The Sun Dome, home to 59,000 people, compared to the millions that slept beneath them. Amos gave me a brief of all of the details of hubris, as I had Vibben's corpse escorted to the gun cutter, acting as our temporary accommodation. I placed the Scipio on her corpse. It deserved to be with her. There was no discernible cycle, but it was late. I was tired by then. I spent another hour with Amos in his cramped, data slate-filled room, preparing a report. I set out the basic details, reserving anything I felt he didn't need to know. I accounted for my actions. I made Amos check them against local law, to prepare myself in case Carpel raised a prosecution. I wasn't unduly worried about the custodian, and in truth I was bulletproof against local legislation. But I wanted to check anyway. An Amalathian prides himself on working within the structures of Imperial society, not above or beyond them, or through them, as a monodominant might. I wanted Carpel and the senior officials of hubris on my side, helping my investigation. In my dreams, I saw once again the man with blank eyes. a reoccurring nightmare that is shared with visions of Iclone. I shaved, and dressed in black linen with high boots and a formal jacket of scaled brown hide. I wore my inquisitorial rosette at my throat. I intended to show Carpel I meant business. It was noon on Hubris when I and Amos approached the high-decorated cathedram that housed its ruling elite. They were arrayed in a circular seating that stretched high up to the stained glass windows. The chatter fell silent as my name was announced. "They are all dead," said the High Custodian. "All 12,142. Processional 212 is dead. None survived the trauma. Hubris has my sincere sympathies, High Custodian." And then the hall exploded in pandemonium. Voices screeching and shouting and clamoring. "Your sympathies. Your damned sympathies," one voice retorted. "A great part of our ruling elite died in one night, and we have your sympathies to console us?" "That is all I can offer, High Custodian," I responded. I could feel Amos shivering at my side, making aimless notes on his wrist slate about customs and clothing and language. Anything to take his mind from the confrontation. The Hubris nobility wanted someone, something to blame, and Iclone was dead. They blamed me, decrying that I must have brought the vagrant here, chased him and led him to this reckless mass murder. I was angry now, my replies growing shorter. I presented the report I and Amos had worked on. I held up the data slate report for them all, throwing the stud that scrolled the words across the screen. "And what about this? The evidence that Iclone had been planning a move against your world for almost a year. Gathering this last night, an unregistered starship moved in and out of your orbit to deliver Iclone 3 days ago, unnoticed by your planetary overwatch and the Custodian Guardians. Or the itemized stream of astropathic communication that your local enclave noticed but didn't bother to source or translate." I tossed the slate into Carpel's lap. Hundreds of eyes stared at me in shocked silence. "You were wide open. He exploited you. Don't blame me for anything except being too late to stop him. As I said, you have my sincere condolences. And next time you choose to confront an Imperial Inquisitor," I added, "you may want to be more respectful. I'm excusing a lot because I recognize the trauma and loss you have suffered, but my patience isn't limitless, unlike my authority." All the faces around me looked shocked, cowed, all except a tall blonde man that stood beside me and Amos. We continued the rest of our discussion in private. I changed tactics, choosing language that spoke of a common cause, imploring the High Custodian and the people of Hubris to rise to the Emperor's work. Iclone was a facilitator, creating vast operations with many moving parts. He did not work alone. The remnants of his operation in Hubris I would root out. The High Custodian agreed, asking for one compromise that I was hesitant to agree to. The tall blonde man, Godwin Fishig of the local Arbites, would accompany me. I, Amos, Fishig, and Tutorone of Hubris' medical staff stood over the cold, dead form of Iclone, examining his tattoos and scars for details. Though dead, he could tell secrets, even if it was infinitely more difficult. Something pointed out sarcastically by Fishig. Looking through the wound that hollowed out his face, he asked me jokingly if Iclone had made me angry. "I'm an Inquisitor. I do not get angry," I replied. I wasn't sure how true my words were. From Iclone's body a last surprise wiggled out. Xenos tech. A silver metallic worm that darted around the room, looking for a victim to gore through. I dived as Fishig threw munitions at it. I drew my blade as the silver worm came for me. It began devouring down to the hilt as I scrambled. Only when Tutorone took out a medical saw and sliced it did the assassin pause. A final drop into a bucket of acid ended the encounter. It seemed Iclone had a nasty surprise for the one who finally put him down. I know which one of you I'd rather have around in a fight, I muttered. Tutorone laughed, and Fishik didn't. Further interrogations began, with Iclone's captured man who I knocked out during the encounter, but it proved useless. Iclone had used his psychic abilities to force many to his will. The poor souls had simply been sourced muscle, but ones that knew too much. I handed them over to Fishik for execution. Such is the sacrifice in the Emperor's service. Only Iclone's transport gave anything useful. Thracian Primaris, an Imperial watch station, and Gudrun. Gudrun was a primary trade world. Old cultures, old families. Gudrun, I pondered. My Vox link chimed in my ears. It was Midas Betancourt. Ever hear of a thing called the Pontius? No, I replied. I haven't either, he continued. But Loing's cracking some of the old scripts. In the weeks before Iclone arrived, someone was sending messages off the approved links to a location in the Sun Dome. They talk about the delivery of the Pontius. It's all rather vague and indirect, said Betancourt. Do you have a location? I replied. Why else do you employ us? He retorted. Thorview 12011. On the west side of the dome, the high rent quarter. Amos and I rose from the table. We turned to find Fishik standing there. He was wearing his full flak armor, carapaced and a visored helm of the Arbites now. I have to admit the effect was impressive. Going somewhere without me, Inquisitor? He smirked. Adeptus Arbites, make yourself known, Fishik bellowed, his voice amplified by his helmet speaker. They did. Rapid gunfire, heavy caliber, blew away the terrace rail, decapitating potted shrubs and dwarf trees, cropped flower beds, and chopped down the deck's aerial mast. Thorview 12011 held the last of Iclone's associates, and we had just made our introduction. Have it your way, bellowed Fishik, and rolled in, pumping his shotgun. The blasts were deafening. As I followed behind into the perfumed luxury rooms, a pleasure girl came out of a side room and screamed, darting for the covers of a bed. I pushed in further, wary of the gun muzzle that stuck out from the adjoining bathroom. Come out, I said, imbuing it with the will. A tattooed man walked out, but began to resist my further commands. I blew off the side of his face. The girl was still crouched, unclothed, at the end of the bed, shivering. I was surprised she hadn't bolted out of the cover at my command, too. I spun to face her. What's your name? Liz B, she replied. Full name, I snapped. I wasn't concentrating on her especially, but there was something about her. An air, a tone. Elizabeth Beckwin, pleasure girl. I worked in the Sun Dome these past 4 dormants. 2 more assailants burst in. I put one down as the other charged me. We wrestled onto the makeshift bed until he stopped, the girl pulling a dagger out of the man's back. An act she had done to save her own skin from me, I believed. The scrutability of an Inquisitor. The violence died down as the last hired muscle lay at my feet, bloodied but alive. You didn't kill this one deliberately, did you? Asked Fishik. He smiled slightly, as if pleased that I had noticed. The man began spluttering about his so-called rights. You are in the custody of the Imperial Inquisition, I told him frankly. You have no rights whatsoever. I glanced at Fishik out of courtesy. Brace yourself, I said. He stepped back. Tell me your name, I said, using my will. The man in the chair spasmed. Simon Croats, he gasped. Godwin Fishik, spat the Arbites captain involuntarily. He blushed and moved away, busying himself with a search. I dragged out the information. An employee of Merchant Guild Synesius, the transportation sponsor Iclone had used to arrive at Hubris. I asked about this Pontius, only to be met with a blank stare. as I heard a distinctive pop in the victim's mind. A failsafe. As if in tandem, explosives triggered in the adjoining room. A psychic trap designed to keep iClone's secrets almost claimed us, as I and Fishik were knocked back by the blast. The impact left us exhausted, but alive. I returned to Amos hours later after a field patch-up. Whatever this Pontius was, it was the key in finding the sponsors and facilitators of iClone. Pontius was a common enough name, but only one coincidence came up that couldn't be ignored. Pontius Glaw. A man dead for over 2 centuries. The 7th son of Oberyn Glaw, one of the greatest patriarchs of that line, that ran his operations from Gudrun. Pontius had suffered the fate of most junior siblings, in that there had been precious little for him to inherit once his older brothers had taken their turn. His oldest brother, another Oberyn, had become lord of the house. The second eldest had been gifted the control of the stock holdings. The third had taken on the capacity of the house militia. The fourth and fifth married politically, and entered the administratum at high levels, and so on it went. Pontius Glaw had become a disciple of chaos, a devotee of the most abominable and obscene forces that haunt this galaxy. He drew a coven around him, and over a period of 15 years, committed unspeakable and increasingly brazen acts of evil. He was slain eventually, his coven along with him, by an inquisitorial purge led by the great Absalom Avengian. House Glaw participated in this overthrow, desperate to be seen distancing themselves from his crime. It is likely this alone prevented the entire family from being pulled down with him. We needed to head to Gudrun. I asked Midas to arrange transport. As I went to speak with the guest I had asked the Arbites to bring to me, Elizabeth Beckwin stood in my chamber. She was distraught, expecting death at Hubert's Arbites' hands. If she was what I thought she was, though, she was a potential asset. I offered her employment. She swayed forth, placing her hands upon me, clearly believing this was a continuation of her previous work. Her physical touch was repulsive, even stronger than her aura. This all but confirmed my suspicion in my mind. She set her head to one side and considered my offer. "You are an odd one. All right. Are all Inquisitors like you?" she said to me. "No," I replied. Midas's transportation arrangement fell onto a rogue trader vessel, the Ascend. It was 3 kilometers long by my estimation, and fully 700 meters deep at its broadest part. Its nose was a long, sleek cone of a cathedral-like spire, made of overlapping Gothic curves, and barred with bronze finials and spines. I, Midas, Beckwin, Fishik, and Loink, my personal navigator, embarked into the habitable quarters, settling in before striding to meet the owner of this vessel. I wore a dark, sober suit of grey wool, black boots, and gloves, and a long navy blue leather coat with a high collar. I had taken a stub pistol from the weapons locker, and had it in a holster rig under my left arm. My inquisitorial rosette was buttoned away inside a pocket. Unlike Fishik, I felt no need to make a statement of authority. My rosette said plenty. A hatch clanked open on servos, and a light shone out from the internal companionway. A figure stepped out to meet us. "Welcome to the Ascend, Inquisitor," said Tobias Maxilla. Maxilla was a veteran trader who had run the Ascend down the lanes, from Phasian Primaris to the Grand Banks for 50 years. Though what made more of an impression, besides the luxurious tapestries and furniture that surrounded us, was the man himself. As if in mirror of a planetary governor nobility, I have to say Maxilla was impeccably dressed, but leaned more on the side of gaudy. The fact that the Ascend was manned by an entirely servitor crew almost seemed to match our host's strangeness. The Ascend departed Hubris and made its way to Gudrun until the 5th day. Dressed in our most resplendent finery, my staff and even Maxilla stood in attendance. As we cast Viburn's body into the vacuum of space above Gudrun, I spoke the words of the Imperial Creed. I wasn't sure of her wishes, but a toast of glasses was always our way. My mood was sour. but was outmatched when I spoke to Beckwin in private later. Her choice to wear sparse uniform overalls seemed to enhance her beauty, I thought. She had stormed away when I revealed the truth to her why I had recruited her. Her true nature as a blank. A pariah to the influence of the warp. Her very presence was an asset against psychic powers, but the very reason everyone had despised her whole life. She would need time to digest it. Maxilla gratefully called me to the bridge, as a roadblock presented itself to us. An inspection. Unusual. For the first time in 10 years, Maxilla exclaimed. I'd summoned Fishik on the basis that if the sight of an Inquisitor would help, then an Arbites chasing her would do no harm either. Midas was instructed to keep everyone else in the cutter. As the Gudronite naval forces boarded, the leader stepped forward and his men grouped behind him. They didn't seem to form a neat echelon. Messy, I thought. Casual. Lacking the usual drill discipline of the infamous naval security team. They headed straight for Maxilla and took his documents. They had no way of knowing who I was from my appearance. But why had they not remarked on the presence of an Arbites? I voxed a glossier to the others, as I felt something was wrong. The lead security trooper turned to look at me. I saw only my reflection in his tint-coated visor. I pulled out my inquisitorial rosette. I am Gregor Eisenhorn, Imperial Inquisitor. You are Eisenhorn, he said. There was no surprise in his voice at all. A tiny thing to notice, but not for me. The warning was already rising in my throat as their guns came up. Fishik and I dived for cover as lasballs rained at us. I was sure I saw Maxilla take a shot, and we began to retreat further into the ship. They had heat-tracing equipment, and just as quickly they were on my trail. My returning shots going wild. I used my inquisitorial rosette to bypass Maxilla's security, moving through an industrial level where machinery pounded and fizzed. One on my trail screamed as a 10-ton piston crushed him. I liberated his las weapon as Midas Bettencourt rushed to my side. It had been less than an hour, and Midas had slain 4 upon his approach. We ambushed the last of our pursuers together. Redoubling, we headed back to the bridge, finding the prone form of Maxilla, still breathing. His legs were gone, but then, from the chest down, he wasn't human. So, my bare facts are revealed to you after all, Inquisitor, he said, managing a smile. I imagined he was in pain, or shock at least. To control the sophisticated bionic lower body, he had to have intricate neural linkage. What can I do to help you, Tobias? I said. He shook his head. I have summoned servitors to assist me. I'll be back on my feet soon enough. The nature of Maxilla was alarming, but yet I felt no need to bring this to higher authorities. In high anchor less than an hour later, Prosecutor Ol Madathene stood aboard the Asen. My inquisitorial voxing to Gudronite Naval Command had been answered with a grizzled veteran, likely in turn to express the seriousness they were taking this with. Deserters, Madathen told me. Deserters from the new Gudronite Corps being raised for a new crusade. Not all were happy with answering the call to serve the God Emperor, but they knew my name. They were looking for me specifically. It smacks of conspiracy. One we had to unravel as we headed down to Gudrun's surface. Gudrun, capital of Helicon's subsector, Scaris sector, Segmentum Obscurus, boasting a human culture for 3,500 years, feudally governed by powerful noble houses, whose reach and power extended across 3 dozen other worlds. I took Beckwin's hand as we stood off of the platform. My name is Farshaval, a merchant from Hesperus. This is Lady Farshaval. We come to tender grain contracts with your high houses of this world, and we are told Guild Synesius will provide us the necessary brokerage. I played my part well. Guild Synesius, iClone's contact would be our first foray. I had to admit that Beckwin was stunning. I smiled as she played her part well, enough to leave the Chamberlain spattering on his own desire to seize the illegal Xenos-enhanced grain. This so-called Lord Farshaval was selling. Guild Synesius' crimes would not go overlooked, and when the full might of the Inquisition came bearing down, they would have their say. But not for now. This was my access to House Glaw. Less than a week had passed. I tugged on a thread we had learned of since the events of Hubris. Iclone's transportation from Gudrun to Hubris, and that facilitator. I located Tanakbray. His rose-red jacket was of the finest silk, and his frizzy black hair was raked back into twists, and tied with a ribbon at the back of his head. He had a craggy, singularly unwelcoming face. His drinking companions were a pair of common crewmen, in studded leather body gloves. Master Tanakbray, I had said, in the crowded bar. He looked around at me slowly and said nothing. His comrades fixed me with grim stares. Perhaps we could talk privately, I suggested. Perhaps you could piss off. He replied to me. I sat down anyway. His men seemed astonished at my actions, and stiffened. All Tanakbray had to do was nod, I realized, and the moment the word Iclone left my lips, violence found me. I forced my will into one of his guards. As the others lunged at me, I swiftly put them down, and set to chase Tanakbray as he shoved the civilians out of his path through the streets of Gudrun's capital. We tore through tight corridors on air bikes, until we slammed right into the parade of the Gudrun's conscription corps. The young conscripts of the 50th Gudrunite Rifles made the first kill of their military careers. I had hoped for an interrogation, but Tanakbray's death was no major setback. I, Amos, Bequin, Fishik and Midas slept that night in secure arrangements. Once again, I dreamed of the man with blank eyes. I had only been on Gudrun for less than a week, when I heard it in my ear. Aegis, Rose Thorn. Midas Vox whispered suddenly, Rose Thorn, reveal. I replied, Spectres, invasive, spiral vine. I was already out of bed, and into my breeches and boots, pulling my leather coat over my bare torso. I went out to the apartment lounge with my power sword in hand. The lights were off, but canal reflections played in here too, creating a fluttering half-light. Midas stood by the far wall, a needle pistol in each hand. He nodded at the main door. They were good. They were very quiet, but we could both see slight movement against the cracks around the doors. Backlit by the hall light, the door opened, and I forcibly dragged the man in. I punched him in the throat and rose with Midas to face the next foe, until we both froze. I felt a will, a psychic pressure far stronger than mine freeze me. I saw the man. He was very old, with a weathered, lined face, his throat exposed at the gown's neckline, betrayed traces of augmetic work that undoubtedly encased his age-twisted body. My mind felt like bursting, as I retreated into the core of my being, until Amos and Bequin burst into the room. The old man looked surprised, as his power evaporated. The conflict ended as I finally recognized the figure. Commodus Voke, Ordos Xenos, a legend and my far senior. We pulled his interrogator, a brutish man named Haldane. It seemed we both had a problem with jurisdiction. Voke had been investigating House Glaw for over a year, and the death of Tanakbray had brought me and my staff to his attention. We agreed to combine knowledge and work together. It was not unheard of for inquisitorial factions to battle, but I had no intention. House Glaw knew Voke from his visits, where all had seemed to be clean, but they didn't know me, my staff, or Haldane. The next day, I and Bequin dressed in our Farshavel personas, accompanied by Haldane and Midas as pseudo-guards, and Amos as an aide. Rain and darkness soaked the House Glaw estate, a 3-story main house built in the neo-Gothic style, dominating a bluff and staring down across the deep valley from 100 window eyes. The lime-washed stone glowed lambently in the twilight. Adjoining the main structures were substantial wings, built at different times. One led to a stables, and the other considerable stone outbuildings along the edge of the woodland. I presumed this to be the servants' block. The other wing edged the crown of the bluff, and was dominated by a dome that shone gold in the sinking sun. The palace was huge, and no doubt labyrinthian. The population of a modest town could have been accommodated within it. We joined a massive feasting hall, filled with other guests likely of equal importance. As I scanned the room, I made a point to take notice of the more distinguished figures. Oberon Glaw, current head of House Glaw, a tall man with more chiseled features than the rest of his household. There was a distinguished simplicity to him, a control the others didn't possess. Cherubael Glaw, brother to Oberon, was a thick and puffy man, hair slick and somehow the head of Glaw's household guard. Gorgon Locke, a raw-boned giant with hooded, sunken eyes. He had long red hair, tied back and beaded, and his jutting chin was peppered with silver stubble. I wondered about his ship and his business. I would contact Maxilla and make inquiries. Most curiously was Ecclesiarch Datso, a rather meek figure who seemed to often draw Oberon's attention. I had Haldane and Midas sweep the estate for security devices and schematics as I made my way outside to the lime-washed stone of the gardens. I pressed my will into 2 guards, driving an opening and made my way through the shadows, holding tight along the Gothic structure as the rain slicked my holds. My goal was the launch hangars on the far side of the rear yard. The hours of the gathering progressed, and I pressed in from the outside back into the sub-levels of the estate, until I overheard voices. The Glaws were speaking with Locke. I could barely make out their words, other than Saruthi. A guard stepped through an adjacent chamber, and looked directly at me. I knocked him down, and attempted to drag him into another room. Within sat a single piece of obsidian, 2 meters high. The glassy stone seemed to glow with an internal light. On top of it was a jeweled prayer box, about 30 centimeters square. I lifted the lid carefully with the blade of my knife tool. In a bed of velvet lay an intricate sphere, but I had made a mistake. The guard I had knocked down rose. I spun quickly, the blood dripping from his head as he screamed, "Step away from the Pontius scum!" Others came running in, as then something psychic, dark, and monstrously powerful rushed into my mind from somewhere behind me, and I blacked out. I awoke. I was strapped down upon a torturous table. My mind and ears were humming with pain, as Locke, Oberon, and Cherubael loomed above me. My index needle is lancing right into your parieto, occipedal sulcus, Locke whispered in my ear. Directly influencing your truth center, he said. You cannot lie, no matter what. What do you know of the true matter? He spat. Nothing, I stammered. He jiggled the needle, and pain ignited inside my head. What is your name? Gregor Eisenhorn, I rasped. Where were you born? He continued. Decair's world. Your first conquest. I was 16. A maid in the Skolum. Your darkest fear. The man with the blank eyes. I blurted out the last. All were true, all involuntarily. But that last one surprised even me. Locke wasn't finished. He jiggled the needle and pierced the back of my neck with others, so that my body went into paralysis and ice flowed down my veins. The questions began again. What do you know of the true matter? Nothing, I screamed. Without wanting to, I began to weep with the pain. Gorgon Locke continued to question me for 4 hours. 4 hours that I knew about. Beyond those I recall nothing. The torture would disfigure the nerves in my face permanently. I would never smile again. The cheers of the crowds were deafening. I had awoken bloodied and cradled by Bequin and Amos. Haldane too had been captured, but Midas Betancourt had slipped the house guard. My body felt numb as we were ushered onto the sands of a fighting pit deep in the Glaw's estate. The Carnodon. It was 6 meters from nose to whipping tail. 900 kilos of muscle, sinew, striped pelt and soaring tusks. They had been starved, and the feasting upon us was tonight's entertainment for the crowds of House Glaw. 2 Carnodons stalked around, killing the first poor members of Guild Synesius, caught up in my mistake. Haldane and I ran. We reached for rusted weapons provided and faced down the first Carnodon. My body was sluggish, but the distraction provided an opening for Haldane to swing his axe down upon the first creature. He finished it as he rammed in the butt spike through its skull. The jeers of the crowd roared as Haldane smiled at me with a murderous grin. The other Carnodon leaped. It tore into the helpless Haldane, ripping his scalp, rending the flesh off his back. With a guttural cry, I ran at it, caught it behind the ear with my scythe and pulled. The creature turned, leaving Haldane a mangled wreck. Face down in the bloody soil, I scrambled back, kicking at it. The monster reeled, and then leapt through the guardrails into the crowd. It tore and ripped as the screams grew. My body was failing, but I pulled myself up behind it. I roared at the now retreating Glaw nobles, as from the roof Midas Bettengor launched pistol shots into the household guard. I set to chase, catching up to the panting rotund Urisil Glaw. I slammed into him, and struck him repeatedly until bloody. There will be no redemption for you, sinner. I spat into his bloody face. Or your fool house. Use your last breaths wisely, and unfold your truths to me, or the Inquisition will teach you the pain that Gorgon Lock has yet to imagine. The ground began to shake. From the sky a legion of forces descended, as the full might of Prosecutor Olm made Athen's Imperial Navy, and forces of Commodus Volk began to slaughter House Glaw. 22 minutes it took for the estate to be secured. Finally I managed to sit down and catch my breath. I was still caked in blood, sweat and filth. Pain and fatigue clung to me like a shroud. I sat in the ashes and flames as Volk approached. We descended back into the Glaw estate, to the room with the so-called obsidian block, the location where this Pontius had been. It was missing. Oberon, Locke, and Datso were missing too. Pontius, the device iClone had expected on hubris, but one clearly undelivered, betrayed by House Glaw. The Ceruthi, from Ordo Xenos records, a Xenos breed outlying the subsector, said Volk's servant. Little is known of them, and contact is forbidden. The Inquisition holds several investigations pending, but their space is uncharted. And while they keep themselves to themselves, more urgent matters have caused the investigations to be postponed. I couldn't ignore this last thread. Volk was under the impression that House Glaw was done, that the threat was over, but I was not convinced. The interrogation of Urisil Glaw began, but under the flesh mist of the Inquisition, it had provided nothing, much to the frustration of Volk. Even a conclave of my peers sent by the Helican subsector, Lord Inquisitor Rorken, turned out nothing. But luckily I was pleased at my reunion with Inquisitor Titus Endor. It had been decades since our joint training under Habshant, and his jibing remarks would have made me smile, if I could. Urisil had been put through the most extreme pain a mortal body could take, and had given nothing. It made me think of whatever promises he had been given by the foul powers. It was something grand enough to make me shiver to think of it. To my allies it was all a dead end. But my dreams, the man with the blank eyes, Oberon, Locke, Datso, the Pontius. House Glaw was dead, but perhaps their goal was still to be realized. Damask, outlier to the Helican subsector. Last trace of Ceruthi presence. Months of travel upon Maxilla's ship. We arrived at Damask. There were black flint hills to the west, thick ball tree forests in the wide river valley to the north, leagues of thorn woods to the east, near to where we had set down, and grumbling, fire-topped volcanoes to the south, far away, suiting the sky with threads of sulphurous brown smoke. I, Fishig, and Midas strode across the plateau. As we made reconnaissance upon the ruins of a human settlement, other sites had seemed abandoned, and as I peered through our long-range lenses, I understood why. In ancient armor, a monster that looked like he had stood immobile in that spot for 1,000 years. Just a glance at him inspired terror and revulsion, involuntary feelings of dread that I could barely repress. A space marine. From the corrupted and damned Adeptus Astartes, a Chaos Marine. We retreated to our temporary cutter, as Maxilla retreated to hide our ship in orbit. Timus Rizor, a native of Damask, had been an unwelcome visitor in the night. His Gothic was intermixed with native speech, as Amos explained, so I exerted my will into his mind, seeing only horror, enslavement, and faces I recognized. Oberon, Locke, and Ecclesiarch Datso. The native population of Damask had been forced into a mining operation. Xenos artifacts Fishik and Midas had theorized. One I agreed with. We set out in the dark in a speeder. Fishik drove, using the terrain scanner to see rather than the lamps. That made progress slower, but more discreet. With me, Bequin, and Timas Rizor as our guide, we descended down into the mining operation. Our surroundings began to shift from chiseled stone to something resembling ancient architecture. We clung to the shadows, and after hours of descent we came to an opening. I heard the voice of Gorgon Locke, peeking out enough to see him brutalize one of the workers. He was splitting his skull for daring to damage the merchandise. From what we could see, they placed stone tablets into storages, as Locke, Oberon, Datso and the Chaos Space Marine argued. Mandragore of the Emperor's children hurt to look at. Etched runes upon his armor started to scrape at my soul. Their argument grew. Mandragore made to smash Oberon until a psychic blast locked him in place. It was then that I realized that the unassuming priest Datso was perhaps the most powerful psychic I had ever seen. Shaking, I looked around at my companions. Fishik was ashen-faced and trembling, his eyes closed. Rizor had curled up in a ball in the ashy mud, his back against the wall, but Elizabeth Bequin had vanished. We ran. Staring at the runes too long had sent Bequin into a panic, and without her negative blank aura, Glaw and Mandragore turned to look upon us. Thorn was his aegis, rapturous beast below. I voxed to Midas, lasbolts flying from Fishik's gun, as House Glaw troops and a Chaos Marine gave chase. We darted through the cramped spaces as I felt my heart roar, picking up Bequin as we ran as fast as we could. We passed through a clearly makeshift quarter for Oberon Glaw. When I stopped, I felt something. My companions were screaming at me to continue, but I followed my gut, taking my power sword and unboxing Oberon's trunk, until I found what I was looking for. Using the cover of grenades, we stood on an open square, as Midas recklessly dropped the cutter down. Locke, Oberon, Datso, Mandragore and their guards leveled their weapons at us. I turned and held out a primed grenade to the container I held. They froze. We all did. Oberon began to bargain. Clearly they valued the Xenos tablets that I held. Enough to keep me alive for now. I voxed to Midas to open fire as I threw the case. Munitions flew at us as we darted to the cutter, barely missing the clutches of the Angel of Death. Never before in my life had I been so glad of the skill of Midas Bettencourt. As in the pursuing dogfight, the Glaw ships were sliced apart as we tumbled inside the cutter's hold. For 66 hours we hid adrift in space, until the Glaw fleet left anchor. We were alive for now. Docking aboard the Ascend, I was greeted like a long-lost brother by Maxilla, who thanks to his navigator had estimated the Glaw's fleet's destination. Inquisition command would be alerted, and the journey would take 33 weeks of travel. Plenty of time. As I pulled out of my coat pocket the true item I had taken from Oberon's quarters. Smaller than its housing on Gudrun, I showed Maxilla in my hand, a being long thought dead. I held the Pontius Glaw.
Glaw,
I repeated.
What?
Said an artificial voice. Beckwin stiffened.
What have you woken me to?
what is the last thing you remember, Glaw?
Promises. Promises.
The voice said, coming and going, as if drifting away from the microphone and then back.
Where is Uracel?
What promises were made to you, Glaw?
Life. Where is Uracel?
There was a tone now, an anger or an impatience.
Where is he?
I began to frame another question, but there was a sudden flash of activity, a crackle of electronic synapses, firing across the crystal surface of the ball. It had lashed out with its mind, with its potent psychic powers. If Beckwin had not been here, cancelling it out, no doubt Amos and I would have been dead.
Temper,
I said. I took a step towards the casket.
I am Eisenhorn, Imperial Inquisitor. You are my prisoner, and you only enjoy cognitive function because I allow it. You will answer my questions.
I will not.
I shrugged.
Amos, disconnect this menace and prepare it for disintegration.
Wait.
The voice was pleading, despite its colourless artificiality. I knelt down in front of the casket.
I know that your life and intellect were preserved in this device, Pontius Glaw. I know you've waited for 2 centuries, trapped in a bodiless state, desperate to be made whole again. That is what your family promised you, wasn't it?
Uracel promised. He said it to be so. The methods were prepared.
To sacrifice the nobility of hubris so that their life energies might be siphoned off into you through this casket. To give you the power to create a body for yourself.
He promised.
The stress fell on the second word, anguished and deep.
Uracel and the others abandoned you, Pontius. They abandoned the hubris project at the last minute in favor of something else. They are now all in the custody of the Inquisition.
No.
The word turned into a hiss that died away.
They would not.
Silence.
What would be more important to them than you, Pontius Glaw?
Silence.
Pontius?
They are not caught.
What? Who are not?
My brethren, my kin. If you had them, you would not be asking these questions. They are free, and you are desperate.
Not at all. You know how it is. So many lies, so many conflicting stories. Your pitiful family trying to sell each other out in exchange for freedom. I came to you for the truth.
No. Credible, but no.
You know what it is, Pontius.
No.
You know what it is. They woke you from time to time to keep you informed, woke you from the oblivion that surrounds you in that globe. Beneath House Glaw, for example, in that chapel they built to contain you. I saw you there. You subdued me with your power.
I would do so again.
It said, traces of fire once more flickering along the golden filaments, and woven circuits that encased the jagged, quartz-like lump.
Do you know what it is? They told you.
No.
I reached down and grasped a sheaf of wires.
You're lying,
I said, and yanked the wires out. A brief moan rolled from the Vox speakers and faded. The lights on the casket went out. Air temperature and pressure began to climb again. Frost began to dissolve.
We're just beginning. We've got 30 weeks.
I went to the hold each day with Beckwin and Amos, and we repeated the procedure. For the next few days, he refused even to answer. After about a week, he began to goad us and abuse us with threats and obscenities. Every few days he tried to lash out psychically, thwarted each time by Beckwin's untouchable presence. I dined with Maxilla most evenings during the long voyage, sometimes in company with the others, sometimes alone. One evening in the 25th week, only Maxilla and I sat in the stateroom table, as the guild servitors brought in our meal.
Tobias,
I said at length.
Tell me about the Ceruthi.
He paused, and set his food-laden fork back down on his salver.
What would you have me tell you?
Why you claim to know nothing of them when I told you we were heading into their territory?
Because such places are forbidden. Because you are an Inquisitor, and it does not do to admit transgressions to one such as you.
I toyed with the lip of my half-empty glass.
You have aided me eagerly and generously up to now, Tobias. I suspected your motives at first, a detail for which I have apologized. I see now you are as keen to serve the Emperor of Mankind as I. It troubles me that you would withhold information now.
He bared his pearl-inlaid teeth and dabbed at his lips with the corner of his napkin.
It does more than trouble me, Gregor. It has plagued me, a crisis of conscience.
It is time to speak then.
I refilled both of our glasses with the vintage from the decanter.
Imperial knowledge of the Ceruthi is scant, and as you say, forbidden. I am more than aware that rogue traders know a great deal more about the outside systems and their species than we do. You are no rogue, but you are of the merchant elite. I think it unlikely that you have never come across any information pertaining to this Xenos breed.
He sighed.
As a young man, over 90 years ago, I traveled into Ceruthi space. I was a junior crewman aboard a rogue trader called the Promethean. The master was Vaden Orl, long dead, I imagine. Now there was a true rogue. He was sure he could strike a trading deal with these unknowns, or at least rob them blind of treasures.
And did he?
No. Remember, I was junior crew. I never left the bows of the ship, or went to the surface of any worlds. All I knew was the miserable duration of the voyage. The senior crew members were tight-lipped. It took them, as I understand it, a long time to find the Ceruthi at all. And then they were less than forthcoming. The third officer, a man I knew reasonably well, confided to me that the Ceruthi played tricks on the Orl's trade envoys, hid from them, tormented them.
Tormented how?
Their worlds were eerie, disarming, uncomfortable. Something about the angles, the officer said.
The angles?
He laughed sourly and shrugged.
As if something ill and twisted had infected their dimensions. We came back empty-handed after a year. Many of the crew quit and left the Promethean on our return, especially when Orl, who was a sick and driven man by then, declared he was going back to try again. I quit then, too, but only because I couldn't face another year below decks.
And Orl?
He went back. I presume so, anyway. A few years later, I heard his ship had been taken in the Borealis Reach by Eldar renegades. That's the sum of it. You can perhaps see why I was unwilling to tell you these things before. Because there is nothing useful to tell, except to incriminate myself by admitting I'd gone beyond.
I nodded.
In future, do not hold information back from me.
I will not.
And if you remember anything else,
I will tell you at once.
Tobias, you say the voyage of the Promethean was long and fruitless, and the crew members were tormented by the beings they eventually encountered. Do you not have misgivings about returning there?
Of course.
He smiled with a thin smile.
But I am bound to serve you as an agent of the Emperor, and I will do so without question. Besides, part of me is curious.
Curious?
I want to see these Ceruthi with my own eyes.
Thorn was his changelings. Imperative. In the 4th week, I changed tactics, and entered into discussion with him on any subject that occurred to me. I didn't ask a single question concerning the true matter. He refused to engage with the first few days, but I remained cordial and greeted him patiently each session. At last, discourse began on astral navigation, high ecclesiarch music, architecture, stellar demographics, antique weapons, fine wines. He could not help himself. The isolation of his condition had made him crave such contacts with a real, vibrant world. He longed to taste and read and see and live again. Within 2 weeks he needed no encouragement to talk. I was no friend, and he was still wary and keen to insult on any occasion, but he clearly welcomed our conversations. When, deliberately, I missed a day, he complained suddenly, as if wounded or let down. For my part, I had the chance to realize how dangerous Glaw was. His mind was brilliant, charming, witty, incisive, and formidably knowledgeable. It was a pleasure to talk to him and learn from him. It was a solid reminder of the quality of mind that chaos can steal. The greatest of us, the brightest, the most urbane and learned, can fall prey. The weeks of discussion proved that he was unwilling to trust me. We planted seeds. Beckwin met him in private, without my supposed knowledge. For a man 200 years dead, his only essence remaining imprisoned, his desperation to speak was our way in. We neared the end of our 33 weeks of travel, when finally he let slip the prize the Glaws were seeking, the Necrotuke. KCX 1288, a broken world. We tore in through the convulsing fabric of space, past moons of blood and striated, mackled clouds of dust. A vast sheet of stellar fire swept out at us, throwing the ship wildly off course and hurling silver lumps of rock and ice against our shields. A green haze blanketed everything as we approached octagonal structures that made all of us feel an unspoken tension. The angles of this world defied reason, and I sent prayers to the God Emperor of mankind. The Necrotuke. If Pontius Glaw was telling the truth, our enterprise had even greater urgency now. I had wondered what could be so precious, so important, as to galvanize our enemies so, make them risk so much. I had my answer. Legend said it was the last copy of this supposed Chaos Tome that had been destroyed millennia before, except that by some means, in Antique's ages past, a copy had come into the hands of the Ceruthi race, and now they were preparing to trade it back to the heretical Glaws. We infiltrated down next to what looked like a sea. Green water, showing white at the breakers. Liquid ammonia, Amos had said, his voice a low crackle over the vox. There was something strange about it. Its waves moved from the shore. We strode in further, taking cover as we spotted Imperial naval speeders attacking fleeing troops in Gudronite uniforms. With disgust, I remembered that uniform specifically when attacked upon Maxilis Asen. I and my staff moved to aid the Gudronites. We moved like a well-practiced unit, as Beckwin and Midas took down the speeders with efficiency. I'd never been more proud of them in that moment, even if my face was incapable of showing it. The surviving Gudronites were confused, clearly conscripted by House Glaw before any truth could get to them. They had been running, and pointed us in the direction of the masses that had turned upon them. We rallied the Gudronites, Fishik chanting the Imperial Creed that brought a fire to these soldiers' inexperienced eyes. I took the dress of the Imperial Black of the dead naval officer, and clung to the shadows. As we approached the plateau, there for the first time I saw the Ceruthi. There were 9 of them, as far as I could tell. They made me think of arachnids, or crustaceans, but neither comparison was entirely accurate. From their flat, grey bodies extended 5 supporting limbs, joined in such a way so that the main mid-limb was raised higher than the horizontal torso. There was no symmetry to the arrangement of limbs, or to the way each of them moved. Their scuttling pace was irregular, and without repetition or order. It was disturbing merely to watch them walk. Each limb ended in a capilla of polished silver, a metal stilt clasped into the digits of each limb, lifting them a further meter or so off the ground. The metal spikes of the stilts made a clacking, tapping sound on the hard tiles that I could hear despite the distance. Their heads were oblate shapes rising on thick, boneless columns from the tops of their bodies. They had long skulls, and lacked obvious mouths or eyes. Through several flaring nostril-like openings, it showed their snouts. Again, there was no symmetry to the arrangement of these openings either, nor to the shape of the skulls, and their necks spouted off-center from their backs. I started to feel ill, like my will was about to break, until I heard my dear old Amos utter his unique phrase. Most perturbatory, I heard him murmur. It made me laugh. I felt my confidence and sanity return. I alone stalked closer, the others waiting for my signal. I saw them all, Oberon, Locke, Datso, and Mandragore, surrounded by black naval uniforms, communicating in some way to the Ceruthi. A casket opened before the foul Xenos. Datso reached in, unveiling a tome, the Necrotuk. I set a panic in the already tense naval troops. Lasbolts went flying wildly as Fishik, Midas, and Beckwin led the Gudrunite attack upon the heretics. I darted for the Necrotuk as it flew from Datso's hands, the Ceruthi themselves attacking. I touched it with one armored hand and felt a darkness pulse through me. It knew me. It beckoned to me, telling me to open it and experience its wonders. My body moved on its own, unclasping to open it, until I was knocked from my feet. Mandragore, Chaos Space Marine of the Emperor's Children, was upon me. I scrambled backwards in a blind panic. The stinking Chaos Warrior was right on me, his lurid armor flecked with human blood and alien ichor. Parts of my body broke under his superhuman swings. My sword parried blows, but I knew I was dead in moments. The rising dread in my gut certain. I was on the ground, smoke and lasballs flying around us. As the ancient creature of nightmare stalked forward, I tossed the Necrotuk at its feet. He rounded on me for the kill as he picked it up, only for him to freeze, slack-jawed. The effect of the Necrotuk had affected Mandragore too. An opportunity I didn't waste, as I rallied and sliced his head from his shoulders, his skull immolating as his body still stood, an inferno of dark power burning from his neck joint. Oberon Glaw emerged from behind. Last pistol aimed as I recovered the Necrotuk. I couldn't let him have it. The Puritan part of me had no doubt, but another part was abhorred by the idea of wasting it. Knowledge is knowledge, surely. Evil stems from how knowledge is used, and such knowledge was here. Perhaps if I read a page or two, I could make a better decision. No. I rallied against a part of myself, and threw the Necrotuk into the dark furnace of Mandragore's corpse. I thought myself walking dead, until a sharp piece of shrapnel rocketed toward Oberon, piercing the back of his skull. A piece descended as the fighting died down, and the rest of the Gudrunite troops mocked up Glaw's. I limped away from the pyre. Malahite, the cretin of Claw, was alive and awake, calling out, "Locke, please, please," in a hoarse voice. That was an interrogation for later. I sat next to Fishik, who lay on a stretcher, his face in ruin and an arm missing. My own body badly wounded and broken. I was never more relieved when I heard Maxilla's voice in my ear, as we were all desperate to leave this accursed world. It had only been mere days when Imperial reinforcements I had requested above Damask loomed over KCX 1288. I strode into a council chamber that started to feel more like an interrogation than a briefing. Lord Inquisitor Rorken, veteran of the Helican subsector, was flanked by an Angel of Death, an Adeptus Astartes at the Death Watch, Titus Endor, an old friend who gave me an encouraging nod, Commodus Voke, the ancient Puritan who I had last seen on Gudrun. Next to him, Inquisitor Shongard, stocky and squat, the black metal mask obscuring everything but his raddled eyes. Opposite Shongard sat Conrad Molitor, an ultra-radical member of the Orders I had little love or respect for. Molitor was a fit, athletic man dressed from head to toe in a tight-weave armor body glove of yellow and black checkered, with a polished silver cuirass strapped around his torso. His black hair was close trimmed, and he affected the air of a warrior monk from the First Crusade. My reports that the Necrotuke had brought us together. Outcry came from all Inquisitors, but for different reasons. The abhorrence of Voke, and the glint of desire from Conrad Molitor. I felt the question burrow in further as I answered. The aliens were driven off, I said, and most of the heretics, advanced guard, including Lord Glaw and the blasphemous child of the Emperor, allied to his cause, were slain. Molitor spoke up. No one has asked the important question of our heretic brother Eisenhorn, he said, stressing the word heroic in a way that did not flatter. What happened to the Necrotuke? I turned to face him. I did what any of us would have done, brother. I burned it. The uproar was instant. Shongard and Conrad rose to decry me, as Endor and Voke spoke in my defense. The mock trial ended with the words of Rorken, commending me for my actions. Shongard and Conrad skulked away in defeat, as Amos entered the chamber with the news of the surviving heretics' movement. I felt a tension released from me, as if finally I had validation for my actions. Though I kept my wavering to myself, I prepared for my interrogation. I made my way onto the prison hold, where I heard screaming. I rushed forward. Conrad Molitor stood with 3 acolytes in robes behind him. Malahite lay whimpering on a horizontal metal cage, strung on chains from the ceiling. He was bare, and almost every centimeter of his skin had been peeled from his flesh. I pressed my gun to Molitor's head, until one of the hooded acolytes bade me to lower my weapon. I felt of submission to the authority of his words. This radical had tried to take the secrets for himself. My anger at missing his opportunity was palpable. Commodus Voke and I stood over the dead, flayed corpse of Malahite. Conrad Molitor and his staff had wounded my investigation. Standing at the sides of the altar were 2 Marines of the Death Watch. We had no choice. What we were about to attempt was by far the most dangerous thing I had ever done. Voke and I combined our wills. Mine still inferior to the veteran Inquisitor. The tides of the warp rushed around us, seeking to tear apart our souls first. We peered into the soul of Malahite and began our interrogation. Malahite's soul squirmed as Voke and I peeled out the information. Details of the Saruthi, their corruption to chaos, and abilities to interact with higher dimensions. The ancient artifacts from the mines that House Glaw was trading for the Necrotuke. But most chilling of all was the revelation that the Saruthi had another version of the Necrotuke. One House Glaw would now have to deliver to their masters that they feared upsetting, the Emperor's children. The warp house came to a crescendo as I dove to carry Voke out of its vortex. Branch-like tendrils of bone and tissue whipped out from the swirling, semi-fluid behemoth and tore Malahite apart. It was the most complete, most devastating fate I had ever seen a man suffer. But he was still smiling, triumphantly. Malahite's corpse had gone, and in its place on the plinth crouched a thrashing, screeching horror of smoke and rotting bone. A spawn of chaos. Kind Wolf and his brother Deathwatch Marines roared forward, as the mutated monster began to rip and tear through the adepts and aides, even sending Voke smashing into the walls. I was sure he was dead. My mind was reeling. I felt broken until Lord Rorken strode forward, a glittering silver sword in his grip. Holy fire spurted from the Lord Inquisitor's weapon and washed across the warp-spawned thing. Lord Rorken was chanting the rite to banishment at the top of his lungs as I rose. I and Titus Endor joined our will to Rorken's. Only fire and ash remained of the creature within our sanctum as I slumped to the floor. I spent a month in recovery due to the torment my mind had experienced. In my service to the God Emperor of mankind, no such challenge had wounded me so greatly. Not even the torture at Locke's hands. Amos brought me books. Midas came to play regicide. Even the recovering Vishik, with his new arm and grafted side of his face. Even the still living but on death's door Commodus Voke entered my chambers. There was never friendship between us, but a unity of common goals that had bred a mutual respect. Haldane, from our battle on Gudrun, still lived, though badly scarred. I gave my word to Voke to see Haldane raised to the rank of Inquisitor, but most surprisingly, I enjoyed most of my time with Elizabeth Beckwin. I taught her to play regicide. She read me stories aloud. Her impressions of voices almost made my lungs burst with laughter. Amos, Midas, Fishik, and Beckwin, we all relaxed in my chambers, and I had never known a peace like this. I looked lastly upon Elizabeth Beckwin, and my heart raced. Thorn was his aegis, rapturous beast below, 56 Ezar. Months of travel, recovery, training and strategy had built to this moment. The battle in the skies above this ancient Ceruthi world began almost instantly. The remnants of House Glaw's heretical fleet fought desperately to buy time for the ground forces, led by the man who had stolen my smile in those Gudrunite torture chambers, Gorgon Locke. We split into multiple kill teams, filled with the survivors of the 50th Gudrunite Rifles, Inquisitorial Staff and Deathwatch Marines. We touched the surface of 56 Ezar. I gripped an Astartes bolt pistol in my hand, a gift from the Deathwatch librarian and one I treasured. As we pressed forward, we came to the Ceruthi's edifice. Its great, luminous form was the size of an imperial hive, and its foundations ran deep beneath the white mud. I tried to get a sense of the structure, but it was no good, and I quickly gave up rather than risk disorientation. It was like an ammonite, with its polished segments and perfect curves, but my human eyes could not read its true shape. The overlaps and edges did not meet as one would expect, and conjured distracting optical illusions when any attempt was made to follow them from one point to another. I struggled to recall the exact shape of the corridors and pathways, for the angles defied logic. I, Endor, Lord Rorken, Shongard, and Molitor led our kill teams in further, finally meeting House Glaw resistance, now aided by their masters the Emperor's children, in a vault of smooth, polished bays that seemed to us to have no ceiling. We found our first Ceruthi. They were dead, a dozen of them, their grey skulls split and mauled, still the stilts torn off. They were surrounded by the corpses of House Glaw, Emperor's children, Gudrunite Guard and Deathwatch. I found Haldane standing bloodied over the body of the Ecclesiarch Datso, the heretic priest on the edge of death. Haldane informed me that the heretic priest had come to the site to find a language primer, a translation tool. Without it, the Ceruthi version of the Necrotuk was unreadable. My friend Titus Endor had given chase to Locke, who now possessed it. Another wave of enemy troops came at us. Despite how many bolts I put through the skulls, it was a distraction. I, Midas and Beckwin left our kill team to hold off the enemy as we gave chase to Locke. We ran, entering into a similar chamber as before, spotting inside a foul mantle coffin I knew could only house one thing: the Ceruthi Necrotuk. I glimpsed at Locke, and 8 or 9 heretic troopers. I looked to either side of me at Beckwin and Midas. "Choose your targets," I told them, and began to fire in support of Endor, dropping at least one of the heretics. As they reeled from the salvo, Endor leapt up and ran forward. A las shot clipped him and blew him back against a stone upright. I ran forward myself, firing my bolt pistol which I had braced in both hands. I blew chunks from the block ahead of me, and hit at least one of the enemy gunners. I reached Endor. He was wounded in the chest. It would be fatal if we couldn't get him clear quickly. I pulled him into cover, and waited whilst Beckwin ran up through the rows to my side. Thorn Usher's Aegis. A tempest sinister. I voxed to Midas, who was already lancing with his needle pistols and tossing grenades. Aegis attending. Tempest in 3, he responded. I darted forward, drawing my power sword and lunging at Locke. Our swings clashed viciously, until on my backswing a pillar began to topple. 2 tons of Xenos stone fell upon him. He was crushed, but Gorgon Locke was still alive. His belly and pelvis were smashed under the fallen pillar, and his arms were pinned. He gazed up at me through blinking, bewildered eyes. Gorgon Locke, in the eyes of the Holy Inquisition, you are thrice damned by action, association, and belief, I said, beginning the cataclysm of absolution. No, he whispered, as I completed the exclamation in the name of the God Emperor of mankind. I cut the mark of heresy into the flesh of his brow with the tip of my sword. By the time I had finished, he was dead from his injuries. I felt relief flood me. It was over. I froze in place. I felt a psychic might so powerful that I knew I could never break its hold. Conrad Molitor entered the chamber. Flanked by 3 robed figures, he began to speak of how he could not allow me to destroy this copy of the Necroduke. To think of the knowledge that could be gleaned from it. He told me he would speak of my bravery, and the tragedy of my passing in the battle for 56 Izar. A floating robed figure came forward, picking up the Necroduke as Molitor made to reach the primer now in my pocket. A last bolt from Bequin pierced his hand, and he reeled back. I felt the psychic squeeze almost crush me, until the blank aura of Bequin released its grip. The other 2 figures discarded their robes. Arco-flagellants. Heretics reprogrammed and rebuilt with augmetics and bionics to serve as murderous slaves. Molitor spoke his trigger word, and it woke them from their calming states of bliss and plunged them into a maniacal rage. I, Bequin and Midas combined our fire. As we dived wildly, we took one down with concentrated blasts as Midas attached a grenade to the other. We split apart as the wounded Molitor wailed after me, screaming my name, Eisenhorn at the top of his lungs. Bequin and I ran to a precipice. We saw lakes of fire and smoke as the victorious Imperial fleet began its exterminatus of 56 Izar. Molitor and the robed figure approached from behind, screaming for me to hand over the primer. I answered. I raised my bolt pistol to him and fired. Conrad Molitor bucked and twitched as the rounds tore through him and then fell. His mauled body slid down the curve of the roof and disappeared, leaving a smear of blood behind it. His henchmen advanced, heedless of the shots, throwing off his hooded robe. He was naked beneath it, tall, well-muscled, with a golden cast to his skin. His face was handsome, and tiny residual horns sprouted from his skull. His eyes were blank. My prophetic dreams were made flesh. Terror seized me, turning my heart inside out. The blank-eyed man, though in truth he was not a man, but a demon in human form, strode up to the shining curve towards me. The glowing octahedron of the Ceruthi's unholy text was clasped in one nimble hand.
I would like that primer now, please, Gregor.
What are you?
This is no place for introductions.
He gestured about himself. Lances of annihilation blasted down in the mudflats nearby.
Humor me,
I managed.
Very well. My name is Cherubael. Now, that primer. Time is ticking away.
Time will always tick away. Who made you?
Made me?
The blank-eyed man smiled at me duplicitously.
You're a demon host, a conjured thing. Tell me who made you and who commanded you and Molitor to come after this prize, and I might give you the primer.
He laughed and licked his thin lips with a glossy forked tongue.
Let us both be abundantly clear about this, Gregor. You will give me the primer. Either you will hand me the primer now, or I will come over to you and take it, and break every bone in your body, and defile that girl at your side, and break every bone in her body too, and then drag your jiggling carcasses down into the chamber below, and string you both up on the hooks, and burn out your agony centers, as I wait for the bombardment to flatten this place. Your choice.
You've been in my dreams for a long while now. Why is that?
I pressed.
You are gifted, Gregor. And time is not the arrow that humans like to think it is. A second in the warp would show you that. Why? A second in the four-dimensional habitats of the Ceruthi should have proved it too. Your dreams were just nightmares of something yet to happen.
Who made you?
My voice was insistent. His answer was the one I least expected, and it left me all but stunned.
The Holy Inquisition made me, Gregor. A brother of yours made me. Now, for the last time, give me that!
The demon host swung suddenly around, as voices called out from the lower down the roof. Brother Captain Kindwolf was clambering up, out at the blast hole, flanked by Midas and another Death Watcher carrying the limp form of Titus Endor. Kindwolf raised his storm bolter and fired at the blank-eyed man. Cherubael reached out and caught the glowing shells, plucking them out of the air.
Go home, Astartes, bastard!
He yelled down the sloping roof at Kindwolf.
This has nothing to do with you!
The fiend came up from the ridge until he was facing me. I could see the tiny arcs of power darting across his glowing skin. I could smell the stink of corruption. Eye to eye now, he held out his hand, palm up, fingernails long and polished like claws.
Clever of you to find an untouchable to cancel me out.
He nodded.
How did you manage that?
Fate, like time, is not linear, Cherubael. Surely you know that. But I found Bequin in the same way that the dreams of you found me.
I like you, Gregor Eisenhorn. So very challenging and stimulating for a human. I wish we had leisure to discourse and break bread, but we haven't.
He snapped suddenly.
Give me the primer!
I took out the polyhedron. His smile broadened. I dropped the artifact onto the silky roof, and, before it could slide away, crushed it under the heel of my boot. The demon host took a step backwards, gazing down at the crunched dust. He looked up again at me with his blank eyes.
You are a man of singular dedication, Gregor. I would have enjoyed killing you when the day and hour came, but you're dead already. This edifice is 240 seconds away from destruction. Cherish this.
He tossed me the Xenos Necrotuk, and I caught it in one gloved hand.
You've won. Take that consolation to the afterlife.
He started to run, towards the lip of the roof, and threw himself out in a perfect dive, arms raised. For a moment, he hung in space. Then he forked his body in, executed a precise roll and disappeared into the lake of fire below. I pulled Bequin to me as Kindwolf, Midas, and the other Deathwatch Marine approached. Endor, crumpled in the Astartes' arms, looked dead. I prayed he was, for in a moment this place would dissolve in fire. My gun cutter swung over the edifice roof, ramp jaws open. I could see Fishik at the helm through the cockpit screens, yelling at me. Amos was at his side. I watched 56 Izar dive on the bridge of the St. Cynthius as we left orbit. Petals of flame the size of continents spread out under its milky skin. Sanction extremis exterminatus. After the deluge of fire, the virus bombs. The seething storms of tailored plagues. The nuclear atrocity. It was a cinder by the time we left. No contact with the Ceruthi race was ever made again, and the tainted, glowing light of the Necrotuk was extinguished forever. Thorn requires Aegis. The Shades of Eternity. Razor Delphus Pathway. Pattern Ivory. 3112 M41. It had been a near century following the Necrotuk affair, even the events upon Samita, when my investigation into corrupted guard elements that had costed me my hand. I had waited 2 years for a vat-grown graft, and was placed under the specialist care of surgeon and researcher Kretzia Bashilde, a brilliant woman whose wit perfectly matched mine. She was a secret I kept from my staff. As the decades passed, I suppose I am seen as a cold and callous man, but to those who know me I hope that this is far from the truth. My secret visits to Kretzia had bloomed into a bond I highly valued. I think that perhaps I had said the words, "I love you," at least once. Fonder times came to us all in my staff, as later that year, I stood by the side of Midas Betancourt. I, Bequin, Fishik and Amos were dressed impeccably. Midas had always had impeccable taste, and his bride Tirana joined us at the altar. Despite what my features failed to show, I was happy. We were all smiling, even later when Midas whooped for joy at the news he was to be a father. My pain, my guilt was immense, as only 8 months later, Midas Betancourt, pilot, gunslinger, rogue, inquisitorial agent, fell at the hands of Fade Thuring, a minor heretic, whose murder of Midas gave him far more credit than the weakling was due. I had never quite forgiven myself for not pursuing Fade Thuring in the decades that have followed, but I am an Inquisitor, and the need for revenge could never interrupt my duties to the God Emperor of mankind. 18 years later I returned to Glavia, to the Betancourt family. Medea had never known her father. She'd been born a month after his death, raised only by her mother, and she had come into my service by chance. I was her godfather, a promise to Midas. Duty-bound, I had visited Glavia for her ascension to adulthood, and watched her drive a Glavia long prow through the vortex rapids of the Stilts Hills during the rites of majority. One glimpse at her skills had convinced me. I gifted her with her father's iconic red coat, and took her into my service. A Betancourt once again sat at the prow of my ship. Amos was still at my side, even as I sent Fishik, previously a member of the Arbites of Hubris, now one of my closest aides across the Imperium. Elizabeth Bequin, who I too had acquired on Hubris, had left the field to form the Distaff, a collection of other incredibly rare psychic blanks who undertook missions for me and the Inquisition in general. 338 M41. The accursed xenophile Beldame Sadia was within my grip as we descended down into the warrens of Leth 11. A time limit had been put upon our mission due to one inconvenience. Beldame Sadia had killed me. Leth 11 was a densely populated world, at the leading edge of the Helican subsector, its chief industries being metalwork and shield technologies. At the end of every Umbris, Left's largest moon matches, by some cosmological coincidence, made the world plunge into an eclipse for a 2-week period known as Dark Night. I was dressed in all black, with a floor-length coat of heavy black leather. To the catacombs of a derelict church, I and my staff raced. Me, Mersha Kus, an ex-Imperial Guardsman from Vladislav, Arianhod Eswa Swadira, the swordswoman from Carthay, and Baronsi, and Zhu Zeng, 2 females from Bequin's distaff. Even Bequin accompanied me, both of us believing I would not survive long enough to gain the antidote. Though Bequin and I had undergone inquisitorial rejuvenate treatments, we looked barely older than the day we had met. It was in our eyes that gave away our true age. Talon wishes Thorn, rapturous beast within, Ravener said over the Vox link. Gideon Ravener. My interrogator was already at our location. I have trained a number of interrogators over my decades, but none had been as exceptional as Gideon. I was sure that one day he would be an even better Inquisitor than I. Thorn impinging, multifarious, The blaze of disguise, I responded. My throat was getting dry and hoarse. I felt my body failing as we arrived. The Beldames had been conspiring with foul Drukhari Xenos, establishing her own cult with their dark patronage. We clung to the shadows, bearing witness to a fell ritual, as finally Beldame entered. She walked on 8 spider legs, a huge augmetic chassis of hooked arachnid limbs that skittered on the stones. We launched our attack. My body lurched, but I still kicked bolt shells into Beldame's cursed form. I could hear Ravner crying out Ariod's name as the sword mistress, his lover, fell. A Drukhari homunculus moving at a speed too great for the swordswoman of Carthay. Ravner's echoes of rage fell behind me as I chased Beldame out of the catacombs. I screamed her name, the dying of my light, a rage I could not quench. I was careless. I was stabbed hard from behind, in between my shoulder blades. I turned as I fell, and saw the maniacal face of Beldame's arch-poisoner, Pai. He cackled and giggled, prancing, a spent injector tube clutched in each hand. "How does it feel, Inquisitor?" Pai chuckled, capering towards me. "Emperor, damn you!" I gasped, and shot him through the face. Beldame grabbed my half-corpse, lifting me by the throat into the air. I was sure this was the end, until she exploded into shards. I spluttered, and looked up to see Witchfinder Tantalid, standing over me, holstering the bolt gun he had used to kill Beldame. He was encased in gold-encrusted battle armor, the pennants of the Ministorum suspended over his backplate. He was literally the last person I wanted to see through my failing vision. "You are an accursed heretic, Eisenhorn, and I claim your life. I am an Inquisitor of Ordo Xenos. I have prepared for my death for a long time, but I never thought it would come at the hands of an Imperial." My world went dark. I awoke days later aboard our cutter's infirmary. Medea, Betancourt, and Beckwin had chased the Witchfinder Tantalid. That ecclesiarchal agent had wanted me dead for a personal grudge decades before. His hounding me across the galaxy I knew would come again. Amos had taken the antidote from Pai's corpse. As Ravenor had slain the homunculus, I had lost 3 of my staff in those catacombs. A costly battle. Amos brought me the saber Barbarous Satyr to me, the masterwork sword of Arianid. She had taught me personally the ways of the Carthay martial art. I knew I was duty-bound to return it to the tribal elders of the Eswes Suedir, on Carthay before long. That would mean a round trip of at least a year. I placed Barbarous Satyr away. I would honour the oath, but more pressing matters had arisen. Thracian Primaris, the seat of government for the Helican subsector, Scarus Sector, and Segmentum Obscurus. You can read that description in any one of 100,000 guidebooks, geographies, imperial histories, pilgrimage primers, industrial ledgers, trade directories, and star maps. It was as impressive as it sounded. The world was authoritarian and powerful, and yet also a hellscape of human making. A hive world completely swarmed with cramped human life, surrounded by air traffic so dense it could have blotted out the sun, if that light even reached the surface. I had taken over a month to recover, and though I had wished to travel to my estate upon Gudrun, I had been formally requested by Lord Inquisitor Rorken, a man who since the encounter with the Necroduke affair had been following my career with interest. Medea Betancourt flew the gun cutter down through the traffic-thick atmosphere, towards an ocean residence I and my staff called home upon this world. Medea was young, and didn't yet possess the skill of her father, though I had no doubt one day she would. The estate was rather more of a small palace, though upgraded with inquisitorial level security. The resources of the Inquisition were almost limitless, just like my authority. Over my century of work, my staff's numbers had grown dramatically, enough that I now housed hundreds who brought a unique skill to my arsenal. I had received messages by Lord Rorken himself, who was eager to meet with me, and even surprisingly Titus Endor, my old friend and colleague. though clearly he wished to only speak in person, and another message from halfway across the galaxy. Scalpel cuts quickly, eager tongues revealed. Atcadia, Viterus, Hound wishes Thorn. Thorn should be sharp. Around the stately dinner table with me were Amos, Bequin, Ravener, Jubal Kircher, the head of household security, a trusted field agent called Harlan Nail, and Thula Sokova, who was Bequin's chief aide with the distaff. Medea Betancourt had chosen not to join us, but I knew this was due to the intensity of piloting through Thracian airspace. I was pleased to see that Ravenor was present. His injuries were healing, the physical ones at least. I felt he was beginning to come through the shock of Ariod's death. Politics would play on Thracian Primaris. A victory parade in the name of War Master Honorius had brought thousands of branches of the Imperium to one place, a parade I and Ravenor would be attending. I couldn't sleep well that night. My ground staff had informed me of suspected break-ins in the previous weeks. Planted monitoring devices had been found, and sent a pang of nervousness through my system. Sophisticated and untraceable. I dared to think that perhaps these devices were manufactured by the Inquisition. I raised my sidearm within the kitchen, only to startle a hungry Medea Betancourt. I thought I was being paranoid, until from the shadows Harlan Nail crept, lasgun raised. There was an intruder. From the shadows, an individual in sleek black knocked Harlan to the ground. I launched myself upon the invader, until a familiar voice came out. "Gregor?" He lisped through a bloody mouth. "You did say you were home." It was Titus Endor. "You could have called," I began. "I did," Titus answered. We were sitting down now, my friend wiping away the blood from his nose. I shrugged. "You could have joined us for dinner tonight." "I know. But then..." He paused, and rattled the ice around his drink thoughtfully. "But then, it might have become known that Inquisitor Ender had visited Inquisitor Eisenhorn," he said. "It is well known that we two are old friends. Why would that have been a problem?" I inquired. Endor set down his drink. He had come to warn me. He had been questioned by Audios Malleus operatives about me. Questions about a supposed rumor that I had erred, become a radical, and gone beyond into heresy. I was grateful for Titus's warnings, for the next day the very uncomfortable subject was uttered from Lord Rorken's lips. I was grateful at that time for the paralysis of my facial muscles, because the news Rorken told me made my blood run cold. The accusation had come from an inquisitorial encounter with a demon host, one by the name of Cherubael. It had been a near century since our encounter on 56 Izar, though I still dreamed of those terrible blank eyes. The day of the parade had come. 33 heretic ciphers of alpha level or above had been captured by the War Master at Dulcine during the final major engagement of the Athenian suppression, assisted by Inquisitors Haldane, Lyco, and Voke. Two of those names I recognized from the long-ago Necrotuk affair. In containments by warders of the Navigators Guild, the War Master's victory parade of the heretics was a victory cry that would ring out throughout the subsector. For all my condemnations of the overzealous pageantry of the Novia, I will admit that the great triumph of the first day filled me with a sense of pride and exhilaration. Across Hive Primaris, the largest and most powerful hive on Thracian, dawn brought a chorus of klaxons and bells. Ministorum services, relayed live from the monument of the Ecclesiarch, were broadcast on every crackling pick channel and public vox service. The phlegmy intonations of Cardinal Palatine rolled across the streets of the great hive city, overlapping like some gigantic coral round due to the echoes of the Doppler distortion. Civilians and pilgrims flooded into the streets of Hive Primaris in their millions, clogging its arterial routes and feeder tunnels, and blackening the sky with their craft. Many were turned back to the surrounding hives to watch the proceedings on vast hololithic screens, raised in stadiums and amphitheaters for the event. I knew that the RBT struggled to control the flow of people, and keep the route of the triumph clear. I stood next to Gideon Ravener, both of us dressed in our full regalia. It was in that moment I noticed how truly young he was. Despite all his exceptional skill and promise, his lover's death may have shaken him, but Gideon was going to be the best Inquisitor I had ever trained. The victory train marched. Millions of Thracian Guard, Aurora Chapter Space Marines, Titans and tanks, the Inquisitorial delegation, filled with many faces new to me. For my love of fieldwork had kept me mostly out of our order's politics. Finally, the War Master himself, raised high on a dais, dragging his prized heretic prisoners. The noise from the crowds was deafening. It even shook my bones. The triumph passed under the Spatian Gate, a monolithic structure of glossy white aethysite. The memorial gate was so cyclopean, even Titans passed under it without difficulty. For some reason I stopped, leaving Gideon's side to pay respects at the memorial of Spatian, the gate's namesake. Old Madathen joined me, a man who I first encountered with naval command during a certain ambush upon Maxilla's ship nearly a century before. Now a long-time contact. It felt good to see him again in the flesh. Petals and praise danced in the air until a buzzing grew from the distance. My stomach began to lurch. I looked up, seeing 12 lightning fighters approaching the parade, and they weren't slowing down. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck raise as I saw the fighters dive down. They began bursting into flames as they swept straight into the parade ground itself. I felt the panic and frenzy of the billion-strong civilians wash into the parade ground for safety as the fighters led attack run after attack run. Thousands split apart in reaps of volley fire. People flowed like liquid, a mass of bodies that fell into the panicked fire of the parade ground forces, just desperately trying to hold a defensive line. I saw a fighter ram into a god titan and decapitate it. A fighter plunged directly into the crowds and smear families into a paste of human entrails and gore. I was lost. I was stupefied. I was speechless. I felt as if I should fall on my knees amid the tumult and beg the God Emperor of mankind for salvation. Smoke and embers filled my lungs as I tried to move away. Space Marine bodies flew over my head as I felt a presence behind me. The Alpha-level heretic Psyker prisoners had escaped. I was not an Alpha-level Psyker. I wasn't even close. I drew my bolt gun and rammed a shell into one's heart. I turned to see another popping civilian's brains into sludge. I stabbed at him with my mind just to get his attention, and then exploded his face with a pinpoint bolt. Emperor save me, he kept coming. I had blown off the front of his skull, but he kept coming. Blind, his features a gory mess, he stumbled across the ground towards me, his still active mind boring into mine. I fired again, almost panicking myself. My nose and ears poured blood, and my brain was about to explode out of my skull. A Space Marine in the colours of the Aurora chapter came at him from behind, and shredded him into pulp with his bolt gun. Another rushed forward. Psychic power again surged into my mind. It gripped my own hand and made me aim. It made me pull the trigger. The Space Marine's head exploded. Blood caked my face from the effort of attempting to not do the same to myself. The Alpha-level Psyker left me to die by my own hand, until Commodus Vogue used his own abilities to stop me. Other Inquisitorial staff arrayed around me, barely visible in the gloom. All of us survivors were staring out to the burning wreckage everywhere we looked. The parade ground was on fire, awash with the blood and corpses of thousands, perhaps millions, most who had died in the stampede. A day of Imperial victory had been turned into a nightmare. For 5 days, Thracian Primaris burned, an entire planet in riot, a chaos taken advantage of by gangs that sieged Arbites strongholds. Communication planet-wide was dead, and I knew nothing of the fate and health of my staff. Slowly we managed to carve out order through the tides of bodies that lay everywhere, and made to target the architect of this disaster, Escharadon, a leader from the alpha-level Psychers. Vogue had warned me. He was a being of dreadful intellect, and was not to be underestimated. When we saw the monster's choice of bolt hole, I understood what Vogue meant. The monster had taken a Thracian noble palace as his stronghold, enslaving the local populace around him to act as meat shields. I, Inquisitor Vogue, Inquisitor Haldane, Inquisitor Lyko, Inquisitor Roban, Interrogator Cherubael, Brother Sergeant Curvel of the White Consul chapter, and a gathering of personal guard and arbites made our way towards Escharadon's hold. Waves of controlled civilians mindlessly threw themselves at us, and regretfully we sent them to the God Emperor's side. I and my fellow Inquisitors formed a psychic shield. Together our might was just strong enough to hold back the lashing mind of the psychotic Escharadon. We hit a snag, but beneath the palace gates we set explosives to trigger a small electric magnetic pulse, aiming to disable the locks, and Escharadon's mind lashings proved he knew what we were going to attempt. The intensity grew in our minds. As the alpha-level heretic Psyker pushed us to our limits, we would be dead in mere moments, the weaker members of our group, and we had no time. We triggered the explosives. The blast took out the defenses. It filled the sewer tunnel we hunkered in, with flickering destruction. It would have killed us but for the fact that Brother Sergeant Curvel shielded us with his massive armored body. It cost him his life, and I made a point to have his name and memory celebrated by the White Consuls. The void shield collapsed in on itself, blacking out the palace's systems with a thunderclap of electromagnetic rage, blacking out Escharadon's seething mind too. We rushed in. Bodies lay everywhere. Roban and his interrogator Cherubael battled corrupted ground servitors. I saw Roban was cut down as I drew my power sword. My swordsmanship had always been good, but Arianhod had instructed me and the Carthaean, Ul Wila Scree, before her death. Ul Wila Scree, literally, the genius of sharpness. The Carthaean way of the sword. I made a head-height horizontal parry, called the Uesar, and then left and right block strokes, the Ulsar and Uin Ulsar, finishing with the Ul Kea, the death stroke. I and Cherubael stormed out into the ground gardens, the thunder and rain roaring around us, until I saw Inquisitor Lyko, gun barrel aimed at a robed figure. He ignited the Psyker until nothing but charred sludge remained. The desolation of Thracian Primaris had cut the Imperium deep. Millions dead, from the civilians to even Astartes and inquisitorial agents in their thousands. But what came next hurt the most. My pupil. Gideon Ravener was barely recognizable. A blood-wet bundle of charred flesh, 100% burns. Blind, deaf, mute. His face so melted, as an incision had to be made in the fused meat where his mouth should have been, so he could breathe. I had left him to continue, as I was shielded under the Spatian gate. The loss touched me acutely, the waste even more. Gideon Ravener had been my greatest and most promising pupil I'd ever taught. I stood by his plastic-sheeted cot, listening to the suck and drool of his ventilator and fluid drains. I did something then I knew I wasn't supposed to do. Something in my century of life I should have been beyond. Something I hadn't done since Viburn's death and retribution on Iclone. I swore vengeance. I, Amos my savant, my knowledge and brilliant mind. Bequin, my aide, ally and psychic blank. Medea, my companion and pilot. And Nail, ex-guard veteran and bounty hunter. These alone I would take for 2 missions I set myself. The first became muddied, as news came from the now-dead Inquisitor Roban's interrogator, Cherubael. The young blonde-haired man was now without a master. He came with his final reports of our encounter with Escharadon. I had to review the death notice of Escharadon to establish causal motive. He had said to me, That is procedure, I admitted. The statement was very brief, he continued. Isharadon's corpse was burnt from the calves upwards and utterly immolated. As in the incidents of spontaneous human combustion, the relics left by the plasma weapons were little more than the flesh and bones of the feet and ankles. Just bare vestiges. And I interjected. Cherubael continued. There was no Malleus brand on the ankle flesh. I don't know who Inquisitor Lyko burned on the lawns of the Lange house, but it wasn't the heretic, Isharadon. Echan, Helican subsector. Isharadon. Our alpha-level psycho-heretics trail had brought us to the mining colony, situated at the heart of this polluted world. News of trade for an alpha-level psycho in a black market exchange had brought me and Harlan Nail to the ground. Former guard and then bounty hunter, Harlan Nail was my best field agent. Strong of build, and equipped with an instinctive understanding of crime-ridden hellscapes. It alluded to a past I didn't care to pry into. Twists, or mutants, were the disguise we equipped as we stumbled around the mud-slick streets of this underhive. Undercover missions were commonplace amongst Inquisitional work, but never before had I donned such a face, nor operated in a slum so far from true Imperial rule. I and Nail played out our parts well, throwing around just enough currency to get the right amount of attention, securing our place as a serious contender for some rare stock. The only trouble we found was the others that had noticed our wealth too. We had seemingly also drawn the wrong kind of attention. I rammed the word evade hard into Nayland's mind, with a pathetic surge and dropped. A massive, spiked weapon sailed through the space our heads had just been occupying, and connected with nothing but air. The run to had waylaid us uttered quite the most obscene series of curses I have ever heard, and dived on me. Nail was going toe-to-toe with two others, a snouted female in black leather, whose mouth and nose were hideously combined into one drooling, snarling organ, and a tall, thin male with a face perpetually distorted by bone and gristle. The female had a reaping sickle in each hand, and the tall male was armed with a mace, made out of a reinforced strut-toothed, with rusting blades of two saws. Nail had drawn his serrated short sword and dueling knife, and was fending off thrusts and strikes from both of them. I rammed my will into one flailing at me. He stopped, confused, until I rammed my weapon through where a nose should have been. I turned to see Nail gut the other two, as our BT sirens grew louder. We ran. I thought you were dead, Beckwin cursed, as Nail and I burst into our room. We had some fun on the way home, Nail had said. Don't worry, Lizzie. I brought the boss back safe. I smiled and fixed myself a small amasec from the bureau. Beckwin hated to be called Lizzie, and only Nail had the balls to do it. The footsteps grew louder, and we dove to make ourselves scarce. When the RBTs burst in, they were met with a truly hideous and compromising I and Beckwin in twist form. They quickly left, continuing to search for their true culprits. We cleaned up and removed our disguises. I lingered too long on Beckwin. In my heart of hearts, I knew I cared deeply for her. I think she did too for me. But I was a psyker, she a blank. To be in her presence, to touch her caused me great pain. It could never be possible. Nail, Beckwin and I donned our twist disguises. Cherubael, former interrogator of Roban, had fit in well. He and Husman, an associate of Nail I recruited 8 years before, flanked the outside of the designated auction location. Uber Amos, my savant, and longest companion, held back. At times over our century together, I'd often likened him to a tech priest, and I was surprised at how damn excited he seemed to be in fieldwork again. Our trio took our place in the market makeshift stand in this slum, looking to our sides at our competitors. I had to hold in my laughter to what seemed to be a scantily clad cult of nobles, who looked way in over their head. Other mutants, crime lords such as an elderly figure going by Murdoch, and robe figures that flanked us as the auction began. An alpha-level psyker was on sale. I placed my own prices to far exceed the others, until I saw him. Inquisitor Lyko himself strode out into the middle, a red dust trail trailing behind him. I ran cold. Something felt wrong. One of the robe figures stopped still, then strode towards us aggressively. He reached up and pulled his hood back. The flesh of his face disintegrated as he pulled it away, revealing his blank, piercing eyes. "Oh, Gregor, you do so like to make an entrance, don't you?" said Cherubael. His was the last face I had expected to see here, though it had been in my mind and my nightmares for nearly 100 years.
It's been a while, hasn't it, Gregor? I've thought of you often. Fondly. You bested me on 56 Izar. I held a grudge for a while, I must admit. But when I learned you had survived after all, I was quite delighted. It meant there would be a chance for us to meet again.
The orange collar suit began to burn and collapse off him, in molten hanks until he was naked. He rose gently, arms by his side, like a dancer, and hovered on the wind a few meters above the churned soil. He was still tall and powerfully made, but the ore that shone from him was more sickly green than the gold I remembered. Unhealthy, bulging veins corded his body, and the nub horns in his brow had grown into short, twisted hooks.
And so we meet again. Aren't you going to say anything?
I could feel Beckwin shaking in terror beside me.
Stay calm. Stay still,
I told her. The demon host glanced at her, and his smile widened.
The untouchable! How wonderful! An almost exact repeat of our first encounter. How are you, my dear?
What do you want?
Want?
You always want something. On 56 Izar, it was the Necrotouche. Oh, I forgot. You never want anything, do you? You're just a slave, doing another's bidding.
Cherubael frowned slightly.
Don't be uncivil, Gregor. You should treasure the fact that I've taken a personal interest in you. Most things that cross me get destroyed very quickly. I could have hunted you out years ago, but I knew there was a bond.
More of your riddles. More nothings. Tell me something real. Tell me about Vogel Passionata.
He laughed, an ugly sound.
Oh, you heard about that, did you?
Reports of the incident have made me suspect in the eyes of many.
I know, bless you. That wasn't my intention. It was just a tiny error on my part. I'm sorry if it inconvenienced you.
I have no wish to be seen as a man who would form a compact with demons.
I'm sure you haven't. But that is what's happening, whether you like it or not. Destiny, Gregor. Our destinies are entwined in ways you cannot even begin to see. Why else would you dream about me?
Because it has become a central goal of my life to hunt you down and banish you.
Oh, this is a lot more than simple professional obsession. Think, why do you really dream of me? Why do you search for me so diligently, even hiding the extent of that search from your masters?
My mind was racing.
And why did I spare you? If it had been you on Vogel Passionata, I would have let you live. I let you live on Thracian.
What?
You stopped to pay homage at Spatian's tomb, and the gate shielded you from the disaster. Why did you stop? You don't know. You can't explain it, can you? It was me, watching over you, planting the suggestion in your mind, making you pause for no reason. We've been working together all along.
No!
You know it, Gregor. You just don't know you know it.
Cherubael floated away a short distance and looked around. The auction site was frozen, all eyes on him. No one dared move, not even the most weak-willed twist guard. Even those present who didn't know what he was, recognized the extraordinary evil and power he represented. Several armed men stepped out of their cover, and the chew after tangles approached. It was Lyco, with 6 grisly examples of hired muscle.
Look who I found, Lyco. I sprung this trap just like you suggested, to discover if anyone was on your tail. And look who it turned out to be.
Eisenhorn, Lyco murmured, fear crossing his face for a second. He looked over at Cherubael. I said, what are you waiting for? Kill them and we can be gone. It was suddenly clear to me Lyco wasn't the demon host's master. Like Conrad Molotov all those years before, Lyco was another pawn. A corrupted agent of someone. Something else.
Must I?
Asked the hovering figure. Do it! No witnesses! Lyco whipped around and incinerated the old man with his plasma gun. That broke the impasse. Fawn's people and the other buyers broke in panic, drawing weapons, shouting. Indiscriminate shooting began. Lyco's gunmen, all ex-military types with autocannons, hosed the staging area and cut down the fleeing twists. I saw Fant Malsek hit by a burst of fire and collapse in rough sections backwards off the platform. His horn-headed minder ran at Cherubael, firing a grubby old las pistol. Cherubael hadn't moved. He was simply watching the murder around him. The lad's shot sizzled off his skin, and he glanced down at the twist, as if his reverie had been broken. The demon host didn't even move a hand, a finger. There was just a slight nod in the direction of the horned minder, and the miserable twist was somehow filleted where he stood, waves of force stripping off his flesh and popping out his skeleton. Parts of it still articulated. I felt the warp churning around that dismal place as Cherubael went to work. Once he had started, his fury was unstinting. Murdoch's war runners disappeared in a sudden vortex and died, fused together. The mud beneath Vasik's feet boiled, and she and her bodyguard sank, screaming and thrashing. I was frozen, rigid. I felt Bequin pulling at me, shot seared past my face. I snapped around, and saw 2 of Lyco's men charging us. One dropped suddenly, headshot by what could only have been a sniping round from Hussman, out in the torn undergrowth. Nail flew past me, and gunned down the other. He yelled at me. There was blood and filth swirling plant fiber in the air. A warp storm was crackling around us, so dense and dark we could barely see, barely standing against its churning force. But I could make out the glowing shape of Cherubael through it all. I drew my power sword and ran towards him. Bequin screamed. I had no choice. I had waited the best part of 100 years. I would not let him go again. He floated around to face me, smiling down.
Put that away, Gregor. Don't worry, I won't kill you. Lyco has no power over me. I'll deal with his complaints later, and...
Who does have power over you? Who is your master? Tell me! You caused the atrocity on Thracian, didn't you? Why? On whose orders?
Just go away, Gregor. This is not your concern now. Go away.
I think he was honestly surprised when I hacked the power sword into his chest. I don't really know if I'd imagined I could do him any harm. The blessed blade almost disemboweled him before it exploded and hurled me backwards. He looked down in dismay at the wound across his torso. Warp energies bright and toxic were spilling out of it. In a second, the wound had closed as if it had never been.
You little fool!
Said Cherubael. I found myself flying backwards through the air, blood in my mouth. The impact of my landing shook my bones and smashed the breath out of me. My head swam. The demon host power had thrown me a good 30 meters across the site, into the underbush. Furious psychic detonations went off all around. Screaming, semi-sentient winds from the deepest warp snaked around the field, destroying the last of the twists and the fleeing buyers. I tried to rise, but consciousness left me. Thorn wishes multifarious changelings. Pattern thimble. Cherubael hovered above us, high in the roof space of the factory chamber, casting a glow of filthy warp light, choking, twitching. His limbs went limp. Lyco was raising up towards him. Smoke was coming out of his mouth and nostrils. Now, Gregor, Cherubael said. Nice try, but there are some secrets that must remain. With a nod of his head, he tossed Lyco aside. The traitor Inquisitor flew down to the front of the factory space, bounced hard off the inner hull, and then fell down into the churning reaper blades of the factory's harvester maw. His body was utterly disintegrated. Cherubael hovered lower, grabbed the comatose, bound form of a Charadon like a child picking up a doll. I won't forget what you did, said the demon host, looking back at me one last time. You'll have to make it up to me. Then he was gone, and a Charadon was gone with him. The being that had haunted my dreams, the one I had now chased for over a century, spared me. He could have easily killed me right there and then. The rumors of another Inquisitor being spared because of this being were true. Cherubael had thought it had been me then. This had drawn the rumors of heresy, even monitoring by my own organization. And what would they think now? I had chased Lyco as I'd awoken to consciousness. It had been pure chaos around me, as all the groups had opened fire on each other within the auction ground. Just as I had caught up to Lyco, racing through the hive of Echan, I witnessed the Charadon, prone and bound. I had lashed out at Lyco with my will. I was stronger, and I had almost broke through to the secret he kept hidden in his mind, until Cherubael had snuffed him out. There was no bond between us. The very thought that this creature felt something other than hate towards me unnerved me to my core. 314 M41. Scalpel cuts quickly, eager tongues revealed. At Cadia, by Terrace, Hound wishes Thorn. Thorn should be sharp. After months, I and my staff travelled as we made our way towards our second mission. The gatehouse of the Imperium and bastion to the Eye of Terror. The world of Cadia. A bitter autumn wind was coming down off the moors, the turning ribboned leaves of the axle trees beginning to fall. They fluttered past me like dry strands of black kelp, and collected in slowly decomposing drifts on the windward side of the graves. Above, the overcast sky was full of racing brown clouds. I walked past endless fields of graves, ready to be replanted with glorious dead, the moment the etchings became illegible. Such was the sacrifice of this world's people. Cadia was a harsh and miserable world. A people dominated at every level by Imperial military. They say Acadian could take apart a rifle at the age of 7, and had already been trained for fieldwork in their early teenage years. Its cities were impenetrable fortifications that had suffered the wrath of 12 black crusades of chaos. Even civilian fashion was a mix of camouflage gear. My mind had begun to draw lines that made me uncomfortable for what had brought me to Cadia, now inexplicably tied back to the massacre at Thracian Primaris. Cherubael. Godwin Physic strode up to join me, as in my winter gear we crossed the ancient pylons of Cadia. Other than Amos, Fishik had been my longest companion, joining my side since the Necrotic affair and the sabotage of Iclone upon his world of hubris. Grey speckled his thick blonde hair now, but Godwin Fishik stood tall and as built as ever. The news of Gideon Ravner brought sorrow to him. He had admired Gideon. Frankly, it had been difficult not to admire Gideon, and I sometimes felt that Gideon was the man Fishik wished he would have liked to have been. Fishik's great strength was his self-knowledge. He understood his own limitations. His strengths were loyalty, physical power, fine combat skills, observation and a nose for detail. He was not quick-witted. and his abhorrence of book learning meant that even the rank of interrogator was beyond him. Though he would have loved to rise formally through the ranks of the Inquisition, he had never tried, contenting himself with becoming one of the fundamental components of my staff. To try, he knew, would have meant failure, and Godwin Fishik hated to fail. He was my compass, a true Puritan that assured me if I ever fell off the path, he would kill me, and I valued him for that. Fishik escorted me to Inquisitor General Neve. He told me I wouldn't like her, and within 5 minutes I completely understood why. She was a short, sturdy woman in her late 110s, if my eye was any judgment, with salt and pepper hair pulled back tightly into a bouse. She had the typical pale, tight flesh and violet eyes of a Cadian, and our mere presence seemed to be offensive. I could almost believe she was the pure definition of grouchy. The Sons of Baal, one of the many cults that seemed to spring up, and then fall so close to the Eye of Terror. These Sons of Baal, or Sons of Cherubael, had been caught decades before measuring the ancient pylons of Cadia. Inquisitor Neve limped off to grab the archive reports. She clearly believed that I was a fool to put so much weight on a bunch of measuring idiots. She turned and dropped the file case onto the reading table. They might have been idiots, I said, but they're the only solid link I have to a demon host that could destroy us all. A demon host, she said. That's right, and the beast that controls it. A beast that, if I am right, is one of ours. She lurched back down the Archivium. Convince me, she said. I don't know if I did convince the Inquisitor General. I didn't know if I could, but she heard me out and stayed around for another 2 hours, helping me locate the files of connected cases and other materials. Past 9, she was called away to a disturbance in an island community. Before she left, she offered accommodation for me and my staff in the Minster, which I politely declined, and made it clear that I had permission to continue my investigation, provided I kept her informed. I've heard stories about your adventures, Eisenhorn, she said. I don't want anything like that happening on my turf. Do we understand each other? We do, I replied. Good night then, and good hunting. Fishik and I were left alone in the Archivium. You were wrong, I told him. How's that? Fishik replied. I did like her. I was pleasantly surprised to once again step aboard the SN in orbit. Tobias Maxilla, a rogue trader I had first encountered to Gudrun over a century before. Our relationship had deepened over the decades, making him an unofficial member of my staff. A genuine voyage, an odyssey. That was what Tobias Maxilla lived for. And my work seemed to provide him this entertainment, even escorting Fishik to Cadia in my absence. I, Fishik, Beckwin, Nail, Amos, Husman, Medea, and Inchebel. We all sat down to an extravagant dinner. I watched on in peace. Fishik, Medea, and Nail trading their war stories. Amos diving into theoretical topics. I'm sure Inchebel and Husman being held hostage to my savant's ramblings was not how they planned this evening. Beckwin and Maxilla lost in conversation, probably trading makeup tips. We didn't speak of the mission, only enjoyed each other's company. Something we needed. Months passed in the freezing cold of Cadian winter, delving through the archive records every day, desperate to find a trace of how this cult of Baal, or even Cherubael, had gotten planetside. Inquisitor General Neve had made it clear to me that this was Cadia, the most fortified planet in the Imperium. Not to her, her predecessor Inquisitor Gorfal, nor his predecessor. None would have missed an incursion of this threat level. After months, I, Fishik, and Inchebel were called to a location on the far side of Cadia, only to find Tobias Maxilla. I had no time for Maxilla's eccentricities, and simply asked what he wanted to speak of. It was simple, Maxilla told me. It was possible to sneak onto Cadia, and he had just demonstrated it by using my authority and clearance codes. Cherubael had come to Cadia, and one of our own had done it. Neve and I alone rushed back to our sanctum, uncovering encrypted inquisitorial records that took us the entire night to decrypt. It brought us to one name, a hero long thought dead, Inquisitor Quixos. It's most perturbatory, Amos muttered. Quixos the Great, Quixos the Bright, one of the most revered Inquisitors to ever roam the Imperium. His early texts have been required reading for us all. He was a legend. At the age of just 21, he had burned the demons out of Artem. Then he had purged the Endorian subsector of its false goat gods. He had transcribed the Book of Edion. He had broken the wretched subcult of Nurgle that had tainted one of the palaces of Terra itself. He had tracked down and killed the Chaos Marine Bangilos. He had silenced the whisperers of Domacanti. He had crucified the Witch King of Sarpeth on the battlements above his incinerated hive. But there had always been an odor about Quixos, a hint that he was too close to the evil he prosecuted. He was a radical, certainly. Some amongst the Ordo said he was a rogue. Others said, in low, private voices, much worse. But to me he was a great man, who had perhaps gone too far. I had simply honored his memory and his achievements, because as far as I and the Imperium had been concerned, he was long dead. Conrad Molitor upon 56 Esar with a Saruthi, Lyco with Thracian Primaris and a Charadon. I inadvertently had been set on this path, even since hubris. It was rare, but some in my order's history had fallen, often crossing the line between fighting chaos and using chaos to fight itself, as my mentor Habshant had warned of. Kargesh, 314 M41. My band was all aboard, preparing weapons. So was Inquisitor General Neve, and a 6-man squad of Cadian Kazakin. Impressive troopers in white camoed armor, prepping matte white las rifles and stubbers in the crew bay. Kargesh was a way station, used under the encryption of Inquisitor Quixos' orders, and we were certain to find the last remnants of the Sons of Baal, or whatever militant group was working under Quixos. I stood next to Neve. She was dressed in Cadian mesh armor and adjusting her winter hood. She had exchanged her silver crutch for a lift-assisted cane, fitted with a compact cylindrical grenade launcher. We touched ground on station, my feet crunching on the snow. Nail was to my left, fielding a combat cannon. Hussman to my right, with his trustworthy long las. Inshabel was to his right, armed with a brace of antique las pistols that had belonged to Inquisitor Roban. Fishik, hefting an old, trusted Arbites-issued riot gun, had gone wide to the far left. Bequin, a long-barreled auto pistol in her gloved hand, was right beside me. Behind us, Neve and her Kazakin lurked, waiting for my signal. We moved on to the armed rabble, catching them by surprise. None went for their weapons, only their robed leader stepping forward, unveiling a face and shape so twisted I knew what it was. A demon host. Cherubael? I said, foolishly, stupidly. Your witness ally is not here, Eisenhorn, said the being, baring his teeth and gleaming with light. My name is Profanity. I raised my bolt gun and fired. The demon host kept moving as violence ensued. Only with Fishik's handcrafted blessed silver bullets did the spawn wound. I kept the creature's attention on me as the Kazakin mercilessly and efficiently cut down the cultists. Profanity was behind me, hanging in the air, incandescent with power. It was naked, and wore the terrible wound we had inflicted like medals. The right leg frayed at the knee, dripping with glowing white ichor. Entry wounds and burns bubbled and smoked across its chest. Its head hung slack on a neck broken by Hussman's hot shot. It spread its arms, and a hand that was just a thumb and a mangled palm sprayed lightning into the midnight grass. Nice try, the slacked head gargled. With its robe gone, I could see its body was strung with chains, padlocks, and bindings. Stitching needles and other iron ores were pierced into its luminous flesh. Run, I said to Neve and Bequin. Run, I screamed. Neve raised her silver cane and triggered her launcher. The grenade hit Profanity in the lower torso and blew it back a few meters with a flash of Faisaline. It rushed back towards us, moaning and chattering in a warp curse language. Bequin grabbed both me and Neve. Her untouchable quality was our only defense now, and she knew it. Profanity stopped short of us, just a meter or so away, hovering in the air. I could smell the rank stench of eternal murder about it. Its broken neck made a sound like snapping twigs, as it slowly turned its lolling head to look at us. It couldn't attack us psychically, so it turned physical. Claws reached Neve aside in a trail of blood. I drew my rune-etched Cadian blade, a gift from General Neve, and pierced it in the gut. The blade hissed, and the creature snarled. Bequin and I were knocked down. We were scrambling, desperately trying to keep our link. Next I saw the greatest bravery I had ever seen. 3 of the Kazakin leaped upon the demon host. Fearlessly, the Cadian elite had given me an opening by sacrificing their lives. They had fallen in the service of the God Emperor of mankind, which every Cadian was born to do. Aegis, by Scarlet Inferno, Thorn Redux, I screamed into my box. Medea appeared in the gun cutter, and shredded the form of Profanity until the demon host winked out the material verse. Fishig ran to Bequin, as I ran to the prone form of General Neve. I felt my blood cool, until from Husman, the voice of Profanity boomed. His eyes glowed, and the demon hearse burst from his body. Reborn, we were utterly outmatched, until the demon host floated into the sky. The sound of boots grew, until to my utter shock, more Cadians arrived. The bloodied nails shouted in confusion. "Inquisitor Eisenhorn," boomed a vox-amped voice from the lead Cadian. "For crimes against the Imperium, for the atrocity at Thracian, for consorting with demon hosts, you are hereby arrested and condemned to death." I recognized the voice. It was Inquisitor Ozma. Ozma was a well-built, broad-shouldered man in his 150s. He wore brass power armor that glowed almost orange in the ruddy dawn. Ornate Malleus crests decorated his armor. His face was blunt and pugnacious. His eyes were glinting dots set into puffy lids, fringed by heavy grey eyebrows. "Gregor Eisenhorn," he said in precisely enunciated high formal Gothic. "In fealty to the God Emperor, our undying Lord, and by the grace of the Golden Throne, in the name of Ordos Malleus and the Inquisition, I call thee Diabolus. And in the testimony of thy crimes I submit this charter. May Imperial justice account in all balance. The Emperor protects." I was changed to a wooden chair, 3 months deep inside a Cadian prison. Endless days of interrogations by Inquisitor Ozma and his interrogators. It left me a shell of a man. My story never changed. I, Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn, utterly reject the accusation of orchestrating the attack on Thracian Primaris and consorting with demon hosts. There were questions I dreaded, such as why I had stopped at the tomb of the Spatian Gate, saving my life. Why this Cherubael had spared me. Where was the alpha-level psyker? I was glad at times like this that Gorgon Lock had permanently paralyzed my face. My explanation of Quixos's continued survival and extreme heresy fell on deaf ears, for in the eyes of Ordos Malleus, innocence is no defense. My calls to Lord Rorken had got me a trial on Thracian Primaris, but it would be too late, for Ozma had planned to break my mind and body before I could leave. Fishig was my appointed advocate. 3 days before my final interrogation, he asked me the question I could sense building in him for months. Am I true? Is the accusation correct? He had a right to ask. I looked him in the eyes and told him they are false. I am a true servant of the Emperor of Mankind. The cramps began just after what I guessed was midnight. They woke me from a bad sleep. Pain surged through my body and my mind was numb. I hadn't felt this bad since Pai's handiwork on Leth 11, during the Dark Night, almost 2 years before. I tried to rise and fell off the bunk. Spasms racked me and I cried out. I vomited up the dregs of the dire supper. Bouts of fever heat and death chill twitched through me. I was going to die. My consciousness faded. I woke aboard the SN, Tobias Maxilla's ship. Fishik had poisoned me. Used a dose of the reactive that the mad scientist Pai's toxin that had almost killed me when confronting Beldame Sardine, the Xenos conspirator. It had been convincing because I really was dying, and the reluctant Inquisitorial security rushed me to a Medicaid facility. Then my staff pounced, likely covered in secret by Inquisitor General Neve, though she was careful to leave no traces of her linked to us. For the first time in my life, we were on our own, operating outside the authority of the Emperor of Mankind's Holy Inquisition. Quixos, the legend, the man who had shaped me through his work and teachings, was my enemy, Extremis Diabolus, and we were utterly outmatched. The encounters with his demon hosts had proved that. We needed to be better equipped. I needed weaponry strong enough. I needed information. I needed Magos Bure. I had never prayed so much before. I begged the God Emperor to complete this task in his name, before death hit my own brothers and sisters' hands. For months the Ascend travelled to the fringes of the Helican subsector. Dozens of times my staff escaped roaming arbites and bounty hunter squads. Finally the Ascend entered the Chinchair system. Chinchair itself, or more properly Chinchair Rogue System Planet 4X181b, was a blue nugget of rock, swaggering along an almost figure-of-8 far orbit around the system's unique clashing stars, following the vagaries of their impacting gravity wells. Rare and ultra-rich metals, including anciliatum and foridium. It had been a miner's plunder haven for as long as it had been identified. Medea, Amos and I descended the rampart onto the mining facility. Medea had removed her father's jacket in favour of a much more anonymous set of grubby flight overalls. Amos had adjusted the hydraulic settings of his augmetic exoskeleton to hold him in the stiffest, most upright stance possible, with a long tunic cloak of black bagia, a white skull cap and an engraved data cane. He looked every centimetre a distinguished Scholem academic. I lacked any trace of my usual inquisitorial garb. I wore leather breeches and high, buckled boots, an old flak armour jerkin with dirty ceramite overplates, and a full-face filter mask with tinted eye slits that resembled nothing as much as a snarling skull. Nail had lent me a motion tracker unit from his personal kit, which I strapped over my right shoulder, and a heavy, snub-nosed las pistol that hung in an armpit rig under my jerkin. A combat shotgun rested in a scabbard between my shoulder blades, and I had a belt of shells for it around my waist. I looked and felt like hired thug muscle, which was precisely the point. To our surprise, the facility was almost empty. The automatic vox speakers sounded with orders, and yet no soul arrived. I witnessed Mechanicus equipment discarded, something unheard of from the servants of the machine god. I pushed in further, coming to surprise a long-limbed man in filthy overalls, crouching with his back to me, rummaging through a footlocker. He almost seemed stunned to see me. I noticed a distinct birthmark upon his neck as he brought me to his supposed superior, Enforcer Khalil. He was a big man with dark skin and a white stubble of hair and beard. His eyes seemed to possess a murderous glare, as Amos played his part brilliantly, of a scholar expeditionary leader, here on Mechanicus research. My sense of unease grew as Enforcer Khalil led us to some temporary quarters. Amos spoke to me. He thought his words would upset me, about how we were here on a singular mission. Magos Bure, tech priest of Mars, and a close associate of my former mentor Inquisitor Habshant. A distant but trusted ally even Amos had known well in their time together. Amos told me he could see my desire to root out the mystery here, but I am no longer an Inquisitor. I had no authority to pursue any goals other than the ones I had set myself. He was right. Surprisingly, I felt no anger at the surmising of my lost purpose. A sentry in the God Emperor's service. By all means now, I am just Gregor Eisenhorn. Aegis wishes Thorn, by half-light disabused. In administratum by heart, scales fall from eyes. Multifarious, the grasp of changelings, pattern thimble advised. The shadows of men obscured the light from under the doorway. Medea, Amos and I were up, Amos pretending to snore still. We ambushed them as they opened the door, Medea and I cutting down two as Amos broke one's neck with a single punch. At times I forgot my savant scholar's augmetic strength. I turned one of the bodies over, finding again that birthmark upon the neck. We lugged our equipment and began to move. The discarded Mechanicus equipment, the skeleton crew, the clearly missing Magos Bure, and now this assassination attempt. Enforcer Khalil was clearly covering something deep within this facility. I wrestled with the connectors as Amos and Medea sat down in the cabin of one of the mining scavenger pods. Las shots whistled past us as I locked the hatch. Medea launched our transport right into the heart of the mining operations tunnels. The upper workings of the Imperial Allied mines were huge excavations, reinforced with rockcrete and filled with abandoned mining machines. Medea kicked the pod's lamp array and illuminated our path with hard spot beams of clear white light. At the far end of one reinforced spur, the lamps picked out a sudden, wide gradient where the horizontal incuts of the surface mines began their descent. The steep access board descended for about 1.5 kilometers, occasionally flattening into work shells with entries into side seams. The view from the front screen seemed to be black and white, the fierce white light piercing the blackness and revealing only pale grey dust and rock, and the occasional sparkle of Druce. Medea slowed us as we passed one more fragmented, an extensive pile of breakdown, and then, under Amos's instruction, maneuvered us down into the throat of an almost vertical chimney. Amos sat on navigation, his eidetic memory our eyes as for hours we descended down further. The temperature was rising, even within our protected transport. Whatever Khalil and his corrupted crew were hiding, we would now have to find it at the heart of this rock. In fact, the deeper we descended, our box signal grew. Another 3 hours, another 2 kilometers down. It was damn hot. The air outside was thick, with venting steams and gases. Several caverns and dome pits were home to luminous acid lakes, where the geothermal steadily simmered the water. Gorges and the occasional pitch-showered flares of red light from lava rivers and cauldrons of molten rock. Upon a cavern wall, an enormous, perfectly cut plasma hole bored through. Medea flew us through it, until we came across a leviathan of a machine. Medea slammed the brakes. Vade, Elquam, Alatoratha, Semptus, I yelled into the mic. Time seemed to stretch in those daunting seconds. Vade, Elquam, Altoratha, Semptus. The thrumming guns of the beast halted. An inner lock clanked and opened. A hooded figure in long orange robes seemed to hover out onto the platform. It grasped the handrail with both hands and looked down at us. The figure pulled back its hood, revealing a mechanical skull finished in oil-smudged chrome. Its lens-like eyes glowed bright green. Fat black cables under its jaw pulsed, and the Voxcaster screwed into its throat spoke. Gregor, Uber, it has been a long time, said Magos Bure. Magos Bure. His knowledge and discoveries almost worshipped by his brethren in the tech priesthood. He had been a fabricator architect of the Titan forges of Trilix Fal. To my certain knowledge, he was almost 700 years old. Habshant had occasionally hinted that Bure was far older than that. He had no lower limbs and floated on anti-gravity suspensors. He turned to face me. Welcome to the Translithopede, Eisenhorn. spat his Vox emitter grill. You too, Amos, my old friend. I must admit I can't conceive of what brought you here. Is it the Lith? Has the Inquisition sent you to deal with the Lith? News of my disgrace clearly hadn't reached him, and for that I was thankful. The Lith, a hyperdense geode of approximately 700 tons, a perfect ecahedron 4 meters in diameter. Its mineral composition was exotic and inexplicable, and it was alive. Bure relayed the information to us. A previous expedition had returned tainted, leading to a corruption that has spread and ruined the mining facility. The Lith was clearly an ancient creation, whose origins I imagined would forever be a mystery. But Bure had been searching for its true location for weeks, until we gave it to him. Amos presented over the coordinates. He wasn't sure what it was when he read it in the office where we met the Enforcer. It was unguarded information, because they didn't expect outsiders. Bure threw back his chrome skull and laughed, a screeching, mocking cackle. Amos, Medea and I strapped ourselves in next to 2 of Bure's Mechanicus staff. The tech priest's minds melded with the Leviathan machine, and set out to the coordinates. I felt my ears ping, my body sweat profusely as we broke into the Lith chamber. Transport cutters came for us immediately. The cult was already here by some other means. Shots pounded onto the hull as to my shock. Some of them were unshielded and open, squirming with men as magma dripped around them. My blood ran cold as I caught sight of the Lith's defender, a behemoth of writhing flesh equal to our Leviathan, a mass of what had once been the population of this colony. It slammed against us as Bure, locked within his machine link, fought desperately back. I had to think fast. Medea and I darted to our transportation pod. We leaped out of the back of the Leviathan and headed straight for the Lith. It was within reach, the foul black decahedron, emanating the taint of chaos, enough to make Medea fall unconscious in her chair. I lunged for the controls and flew over a lava lake until shots rang from another transport. It was close enough that I met the eyes of Enforcer Khalil. We banked and darted. I felt like my body was on fire from the heat. Though practiced and honed through decades of discipline, my mind struggled to fight the growing influence of the Lith. It came to me then. I rammed my will into Khalil's mind with all my strength. His pod dipped and spluttered into the lava lake. I opened my Vox speaker and began to scream, recording my words into a loop. I chanted the Emperor's prayer of aberration against the warp, a song I had learned as a child, one I had used with Lord Rorken and Titus Endor in the Necrotuk affair. I played the loop until it boomed back towards the Lith. Words, I murmured, your corrupt whispers against my words of power. How do you like that? I pushed the sonar gain to maximum. In terms of sonics alone, the pulses alone would have stunned a man to unconsciousness and snapped his bones. For a good minute or more, I feared it was having no effect. Then the whispering ceased. It became a subsonic moaning of rage and anguish, and finally, agony. The Lith's surface became discolored, as if mottled by mold. It shuddered, cracking the obsidian around it. Then its inner luminance spluttered and went out, and it became indistinguishable from the black volcanic glass that surrounded it. The writhing mass attacking Bure and Amos collapsed. Amos embraced me as I strode back to the Leviathan, and to my surprise, Bure too embraced me, though awkward. It took 30 hours to return to the surface, enough for all of us to recover from our ordeal. Bure spoke to me again, asking what had brought me here. I trusted him. I told him I had a lot to explain about my life in the recent months, that I had come to him because I needed to revisit something I gave to him nearly a century before, something I should have given to the Inquisition. I stepped through an iris valve, down 3 grilled steps into a cell, feeling the nauseating static prickle of the psychic dampening fields. Every surface was dusted with ice crystals, and there was a crackle of synaptic energy. "Hello, Eisenhorn," said a hollow, vox-projected voice. It came from a casket that squatted on a basalt block in the center of the room. Both casket and stone were caked in ice. Tiny lights darted and blinked inside the casket's open lid. I prepared myself, and then replied, "Pontius Glaw, we meet again."
Let me make sure I understand you, Eisenhorn,
said the disembodied voice of Pontius Glaw, slowly and contemptuously.
You think I'm going to help you?
I cleared my throat.
Yes.
So you finally reached that place. How wonderful.
What place?
I felt uncomfortable. I'd been planning this interview for months, and now control was slipping entirely to Glaw.
The place where you cross the line.
I have...
All Inquisitors cross the line eventually.
I tell you...
All of them. It's an occupational hazard.
Listen to me, you worthless...
Methinks Inquisitor Eisenhorn protests too much. The line, Gregor. The line. The line between order and chaos, between right and wrong, between mankind and man unkind. I know it because I've crossed it. Willingly, of course. Gladly. Skipping and dancing and delighting. For the likes of you, it is a more painful process.
I rose.
I don't think this conversation is going anywhere, Glaw. I'm leaving.
So soon?
Perhaps I'll be back in another century or two.
It was on Quenthus 8, in the spring of 019.M41. Ah wore a golden torque around his neck, the mark of his tribe. It was the most valuable thing he possessed. Actually, it was the only thing he possessed, but no matter. He offered it to me in return for me becoming his master. I took it, and, as I said, I bought him.
I sat back, unimpressed.
Wait. Later that same day, I examined the torque. It was inlaid with astonishing technology. Borea might have been a beast world by then, but millennia back it had clearly been an advanced outpost of mankind. It had fallen into a feral dark age because chaos had touched it. And that torque was a relic of the decline. Its forbidden, forgotten technology focused the stuff of the darkness into the wearer's mind. No wonder Borea, where every adult male wore one, was a savage waste. I was intrigued. I put the torque on.
You put it on?
I was young and reckless. What can I say? I put it on. Within a few hours, the tendrils of the warp had suffused my receptive mind. And do you know what?
What?
It was wonderful. Liberating. I was alive to the real universe at last. I had crossed the line, and it was bliss. Suddenly I saw everything as it actually was, not as the Ministorum and the rot-hearted Emperor wanted to see it. Engulfing eternity, the fragility of the human race, the glories of the warp, the fleeting treasure of flesh, the incomparable sweetness of death. All of it.
And you ceased to be Pontius Glaw, the seventh son of a respectable imperial house, and became Pontius Glaw, the sadistic idolater and abomination?
A boy's got to have a hobby.
Thank you for sharing this with me, Pontius. It has been revealing.
I'm just getting started.
Goodbye.
Eisenhorn! Wait! Please!
The cell hatches clanged shut after me. I waited 2 days before I returned to see him. He was sullen and moody this time. I entered the cell and set down the tray I was carrying.
Don't expect me to talk to you.
Why?
I opened my soul to you the other day, and you walked out.
I'm back now.
Yes, you are. Closer to that line yet?
You tell me.
I leaned over and poured myself a large glass of amasec from a decanter on the tray. I rocked the glass a few times and then took a deep sip.
Amasec.
Yes.
Vintage.
50-year-old Gethalamore vintage, aged in Burwood barrels.
Is it good?
No,
No.
it is perfect.
The casket sighed.
You were saying about that line.
I was saying I was most annoyed with you.
Pontius returned, stubbornly.
Oh,
I casually slid a low stick from the plastic board tub I had carried backhanded from Teresia Ungra's stateroom. I lit it and took a deep drag, exhaling the smoke towards the infernal casket. Nail had injected me with powerful anti-intoxicants and counter-opioid drugs just half an hour earlier, but I sat back and openly seemed to relish the smoke.
Is that a low stick?
yes, Pontius. You were saying.
Is it good?
You were saying.
I've told you of my slip, my crossing of the line. What else do you want of me?
The rest. You think I've crossed the line too, don't you?
Yes, it's in your bearing. You seem like a man who has understood the wider significance of the warp.
Why is that?
I told you it happens to all Inquisitors sooner or later. I can imagine you as a young man, stiff and puritanical, in the Scholam. It must have seemed so simple to you back then. The light and the dark.
Not so obvious these days.
Of course not. Because the warp is in everything. It is there even in the most ordered things you do. Life would be brittle and flavorless without it.
Like your life is now.
I suggested, and took another sip.
Damn you.
According to you, I'm already damned.
Everyone is damned. Mankind is damned. The whole human species. Chaos and death are the only real truths of reality. To believe otherwise is ignorance. And the Inquisition, so proud and dutiful and full of its own importance, so certain that it is fighting against chaos, is the most ignorant thing of all. Your daily work brings you closer and closer to the warp, increases your understanding of orderless powers. Gradually, without noticing it, even the most puritanical and rod-stiff Inquisitor becomes seduced.
I don't agree.
Pontius's mood seemed to have brightened now. We're engaged in debate again.
The first step is the knowledge. An Inquisitor must understand the basic traits of chaos in order to fight it. In a few years, he knows more about the warp than most untutored cultists. Then the second step, the moment he breaks the rules and allows some aspect of chaos to survive or remain so that he can study it and learn from it. I wouldn't even bother trying to deny that one, Eisenhorn. I'm right here, aren't I?
You are, but understanding is essential. Even a Puritan will tell you that. Without it, the Inquisition's struggle is hopeless.
Don't get me started on that.
He chuckled, then paused.
Describe the taste of that amasec in your mouth. The quality. The scent.
Why?
It is 300 years since I have tasted anything. Smell anything. Touched anything.
I had feared my gambit with the amasec and opiate was too obvious, but it had drawn him in.
It feels like oil on my tongue. Soft. Body heat. The aroma precedes the taste, like peat and pepper, spiced. The taste is a burn in the throat that lights a fire behind my heart.
The casket made a long, mournful sound of tantalized regret.
The third step.
The third step. The third step is the line itself. When the Inquisitor becomes a radical. When he chooses to use chaos against chaos. When he employs the agencies of the warp. When he asks the heretical for help.
I see.
I'm sure you do. So, are you going to ask me to help you?
Yes. Will you give me that help?
It depends. What's in it for me?
I stubbed out the low stick.
Given what you just said, I assume your reward would be the satisfaction of seeing me cross that line and damn myself.
Very clever. I'm enjoying that part already. What else?
I turned the glass in my hand, swirling the amber spirit around.
Magos Bure is a talented man, a master of machinery. Though I would never release you from imprisonment, I could perhaps ask him for a favor.
A favor?
Pontius echoed, with trembling anticipation.
A body for you. A servitor chassis. The ability to walk, reach, hold, see. Perhaps even the finessing extras of sense actuators. Rudimentary touch, smell, taste. That would be child's play for him.
Gods of the warp. Ask me, Eisenhorn.
Let us talk for a while on the subject of demon hosts.